After his sister's death, Ghislaine Perdium spiraled into this rebellious, wild-hearted character. He transformed into the continent's mightiest and most powerful figure, but that strength only fueled his haunted memories and seething anger. It wasn't long before his behavior got him into non-stop trouble, pushing his own family to keep their distance. Feeling isolated and lost, Ghislaine ultimately decided to ditch his identity, disappear from home, and live like a self-proclaimed madman, constantly questioning everything. Even as a young noble, Ghislaine was stubborn and lacking in physical strength, but the obsession with tracking down his sister's killer pushed him to commit to one mission to become unstoppable. Driven by guilt and anger, he believed that only by surpassing the strength of thousands could he finally achieve his goal. 2.5 years in, Ghislaine's life as a mercenary had earned him serious respect. People started calling him the king of mercenaries for his relentless dedication and the raw strength he brought to every battle. Armed with fame, honor, and a fair share of wealth, Ghislaine decided it was finally time to return to his family, but he hadn't expected to find the once great Perdium clan on the brink of collapse. Luckily, fate wasn't finished with Ghislaine just yet. After being beheaded in a battle by his family's enemy, he suddenly found himself with a second chance to live his life. Standing over a clear stream, his own reflection stared back, vivid and youthful. It dawned on him he'd just survived a bizarre, nightmarish vision. Had he somehow ended up as a test subject for some mage's twisted experiment? Whatever it was, his anger only grew, fueling his thirst for revenge. Just then, a loud voice cut through his thoughts. Ricardo, a soldier from the Podium family, was calling him up. Ghislaine, still processing everything, responded by instinct. He appeared instantly at Ricardo's side, sword drawn at his throat, demanding answers. Ricardo, surprisingly calm under threat, reminded him that things might have gone a bit too far. But Ghislaine, undeterred, held his stance. Though confusion clouded his mind, his anger won over. Ricardo continued, explaining that Ghislaine had apparently forgotten everything, including his frustration over leading a group to hunt down the orcs. Hearing this, Ghislaine paused, genuinely puzzled, and questioned Ricardo about their supplies and plans for the trip. Ricardo clarified that they were headed to the Podium estate, a place Ghislaine distinctly remembered as being in ruins. However, standing on a high vantage point, Ghislaine was shocked to find the estate still intact below him. His sense of reality began to waver, leaving him more baffled than ever. Ricardo cracked a grin, reminding Ghislaine that his family was far from ruins. He warned that if the Count caught wind of him spouting such nonsense, Ghislaine would be in for serious trouble. But it was all starting to click. Ghislaine wasn't in the present anymore somehow. He'd been transported back in time. This was a chance to face his past and repair the countless mistakes he'd made. As a kid, Ghislaine had always struggled with anger toward his family. His immaturity and fury led him into trouble after trouble, which only caused everyone around him to pull away. The constant criticism from his relatives wore him down until he finally snapped and left. For the next few years, he made his way as a mercenary, fighting through countless battles, building his skills, and gradually earning himself a reputation as a force to be reckoned with. When he'd finally felt strong enough, he made his way back to the Perdium estate, hoping for some sort of redemption. But what he found was devastating. His family's legacy lay in ashes. Everything he'd once held dear had vanished, leaving him with a profound sense of loss. Yet now, as he stood there in disbelief, the estate looked untouched, exactly as he'd remembered. His family members, alive and well, were all around him, and Ghislaine was so overwhelmed he felt he could burst into song. But reality quickly set back in. Ricardo interrupted his reverie with a stark reminder that they were currently preparing for an orc hunting expedition. Memories of that day flooded back to Ghislaine, the day when nearly his entire squad would face a brutal end. Ghislaine knew he couldn't afford to let history repeat itself. For his family's sake and his own, he'd have to step up, face down his fears, and rewrite his legacy from here on out. In his previous life, Ghislaine had joined the punitive squad with hopes of making a name for himself. Back then, the reports had only mentioned 3 orcs, and Ghislaine, as an inexperienced leader, had figured it would be an easy task. But upon arriving, the number of orcs was more than double the initial estimate. Nearly the entire squad perished due to Ghislaine's stubborn insistence on leading, despite his lack of experience. While he could have defeated the orcs since they lacked any real strategy, the deeper issue was trust. His soldiers viewed him as little more than a useless, arrogant commander. Lost in thought, Ghislaine was abruptly snapped back to reality as a watchtower crashed to the ground nearby, flung by an incoming orc. The soldiers around him cried out in panic, and Ghislaine remembered how, in his past life, the orcs had struck with the same alarming speed. The battle that unfolded was brutal. One by one, soldiers were massacred, and their formation began to collapse. Scovan, the squad's commander, rushed toward the orcs, witnessing 3 soldiers being knocked aside with a single swing from one of the monstrous foes. Scovin grimly noted how they'd let their guard down, entering the battle without proper preparation, which had left them vulnerable to the ambush. With their numbers dwindling and the orcs far more numerous than expected, Scovin feared total annihilation for his team. Just then, a shout from a nearby soldier alerted him to danger from behind. In that life-or-death moment, a blur shot past, and Ghislaine appeared, shoving Scovin out of harm's way and charging at the axe-wielding orc to confront the threat head-on. In that instant, Ghislaine was determined to rewrite the tragic fate that had once befallen him and his team. Ghislaine, sword in hand, moved with lightning speed, slicing through the orc's hand in one clean motion. The onlookers gasped, watching in shock as part of the creature's arm fell to the ground severed. Ghislaine thought to himself, frustrated that he couldn't tap into his mana at that moment, silently wishing he had come back sooner to prevent this catastrophe. Turning to Scovin, Ghislaine commanded with unwavering authority, demanding control of the squad. Scovin, still reeling from the surprise, questioned him in confusion, unable to process what had just happened. Ghislaine repeated his request firmly. Despite his bafflement, Scovin recognized the gravity of the situation and, although hesitant, acknowledged Ghislaine's authority, understanding that in this moment, his leadership might be their only hope for survival. This time, Ghislaine was determined to make a difference, ready to change the course of fate for himself and his comrades. After a long moment of careful contemplation, Scovin finally turned his face away, hesitation evident in his every move. He held firmly to his decision, reasoning that even though Ghislaine held the title of Young Master, handing over command to someone with so little practical leadership experience wasn't an option he could consider lightly. The weight of this choice sat heavily on him. Ghislaine, though visibly irritated by Scovin's reluctance, found himself understanding his point of view. If their roles were reversed, Ghislaine admitted he'd likely be just as cautious if a seemingly reckless outsider suddenly demanded control. As an approaching orc drew closer, Scovin, undeterred by the looming danger, teleported directly in front of Ghislaine. Determined to protect him, he resolved that he would manage the fight himself, believing Ghislaine's inexperience made him unfit to lead the soldiers under such life-threatening circumstances. Yet, Ghislaine, realizing there was no other path forward, seized his last option with a swift and powerful movement. He hurled his sword directly toward the orc, catching Scovin off guard. Reflexively, Scovin dodged to the side, confusion flickering across his face. The sound of metal slicing flesh echoed as Ghislaine's blade embedded itself deep into the orc's skull, killing it instantly. For a brief moment, Scovin stood frozen, stunned by Ghislaine's unexpected skill and precision. The scene was more than surprising, it redefined his perception of the young master's abilities. Scovin hadn't anticipated that Ghislaine, who he thought inexperienced, could possess such accuracy and combat prowess, turning the tide of the battle in a single, decisive strike. Amid his confusion, Scovin could barely believe that Ghislaine had struck the orc's weak point with such precision. Ghislaine, exuding an unusual calm, glanced back at Scovin with a clear message in battle: the most vital factor isn't brute strength but the fighting spirit. He recognized that if his troops were overcome by fear, victory would remain out of reach. What they needed now was a surge of motivation, something to ignite their courage. Without missing a beat, Ghislaine yanked his sword from the orc's lifeless body and left Scovin behind as he dove into the thick of the fight. Leaping with astonishing agility, he closed in on another orc, slashing it down in a single strike. The sheer mastery of his movements left the surrounding soldiers stunned, and even Scovin was visibly shaken by the scene unfolding before him. Ghislaine's resolve surged, his mind set on one goal: to annihilate every orc before him. Once again, he plunged forward, his swift, precise strikes cutting through the orc's defenses with ease. Scovin watched in awe, hardly believing his own eyes. Standing there, he wondered if he might be dreaming. How could this seemingly frail young master, armed only with his remarkable agility and keen understanding of the enemy's weaknesses, accomplish what even experienced soldiers couldn't? Scovin, a seasoned magic user, felt a pang of helplessness. Despite his own skill, he found himself questioning how Ghislaine, a youth he had dismissed as fragile, could display such finesse in combat. Ghislaine, though clearly exhausted, dodged attacks with minimal effort, every swing of his blade landing on his foe's weak points like a true master swordsman, perhaps even beyond that. After eliminating several orcs, Ghislaine silently scoffed at their combat skills. The orcs' efforts didn't even stir his excitement. To him, they weren't worthy of being called warriors. Meanwhile, Ricardo watched in horror as all the orcs began to pursue Ghislaine, bewildered by why Ghislaine would charge straight into the orc army, drawing their attention only to sprint toward a cliff edge. Even Scovin struggled to grasp Ghislaine's intentions, but as he finally recognized Ghislaine's path, a chill of fear crept up his spine. It led to a dangerous cliffside. Pausing in tense disbelief, Scovin broke into a cold sweat as a startling realization struck him. Though uncertain of his own assumptions, he whipped around to the soldiers and barked an order, rallying them to form a defensive barrier and follow Ghislaine's lead. Meanwhile, the bloodthirsty orcs relentlessly pursued Ghislaine, eager to finish him off. Ghislaine, fully aware, thought to himself that Skoven had likely pieced together his plan if the man truly was a skilled commander. While Ghislaine would have relished the chance to fight every last orc himself, his current stamina wouldn't allow for such indulgence. Nevertheless, he remained confident that Skoven could handle the situation from here. As the orcs chased Ghislaine, a sudden noise on the side caught their attention, making them turn their heads. Skoven and his troops seized this opportunity, forming a solid defensive wall to push the creatures back. Ghislaine, seeing his plan come together, smirked slightly and leaped off the cliff edge, signaling the troops to act. In perfect unison, Skoven's soldiers heaved forward, shoving the orcs over the cliff. The power boost at 200% capacity allowed the soldiers to forcefully drive the orcs down, sending them plummeting to their doom, their bodies shattered upon impact below. The troops exchanged odd glances and murmurs, thrilled by the victory over the orcs. Skoven, still processing the scene, rushed over to the cliff, shouting for Ghislaine in a slight panic. Leaning over, he saw Ghislaine hanging by his sword, which he had wedged into the rock wall to hold himself up. Ghislaine shot a triumphant grin, pleased with his victory. Relieved, Skoven extended a hand and ordered him to grab hold. Ghislaine, realizing his grip was weakening, followed Skoven's command. The soldiers above, now seeing Ghislaine safe, shouted his name in a mix of alarm and relief. In the dim darkness, a voice echoed in Ghislaine's mind, stirring him awake. As he slowly opened his eyes, he was struck by the familiarity of Belinda's voice. He wondered if it was truly her speaking to him, puzzled by how his mother, long gone, could suddenly appear. Memories of Belinda emerged in his mind, clear and powerful. Immersed in these fragments, Ghislaine suddenly felt a hand grip his arm, pulling him forward with an unspoken urging, as if they were meant to continue onward together. When Ghislaine opened his eyes once more, he found himself in an unfamiliar place, uncertain whether he had truly survived. With a fleeting thought, he wondered if the soldiers had somehow saved him or if this was all just a strange dream. As he sat up, waves of sharp pain coursed through his body, reminding him of the physical toll from pushing himself to his limits. Despite the aches, Ghislaine felt a profound sense of relief. At least he was alive. At that moment, Belinda entered the room, announcing with obvious relief that the young master was awake. Ghislaine looked at her, inwardly grateful for her concern. But Belinda, despite her clear worry, couldn't resist chastising him, reminding him that she had warned him he should have let the soldiers handle the orcs from the start. As Belinda spoke, Ghislaine, ignoring the pain that still lingered in his body, unexpectedly moved forward and wrapped her in a hug. Startled, Belinda asked why he was doing this and if she had done something wrong. But Ghislaine simply held on to the thought that he was glad to see her. Memories flooded back. He remembered Belinda, his loyal and caring sister, who had always been by his side since he was a child. She had always been there, no matter how foolishly he acted. After his family had fallen to ruin and Belinda had vanished, he hadn't seen her again. Meeting her like this now felt surreal. Belinda continued, pointing out that they saw each other every day, not understanding why Ghislaine seemed so thrilled. He knew he needed to tell her the truth. Pausing, he decided to reveal that the Perdium family was heading for disaster. Confused, Belinda thought he was talking nonsense, assuming his words were the result of his injury from fighting the orcs. Ghislaine pressed on, trying to explain that he had in fact died and come back to life, but Belinda misinterpreted, believing he was referring to the recent battle. When he tried to clarify further, she cautioned him that his insistence on taking command without sufficient experience could endanger the family. She also expressed concern over the battles he'd faced and reminded him that if he were injured during the upcoming festival, it would only make things worse. This festival was especially important because it was something Alina, Ghislaine's sister, eagerly awaited as a chance to spend time with him. It would be a perfect opportunity for them to grow closer, something Ghislaine couldn't overlook. As Ghislaine reflected on the upcoming festival, a sense of nostalgia crept into his mind. In his previous life, the festival had come and gone without him, a casualty of the relentless cycle of battles and responsibilities. This time, however, he had a narrow window, just half a week, to prepare, though the knowledge of what lay ahead overshadowed any sense of excitement. He knew that a week from now, his life would undergo a transformation more profound than any before. Suddenly, his musings were interrupted by a familiar voice, jolting him from his thoughts. The sound stirred up old memories, and the image of Alina, his sister, flashed before him. She had met her end exactly 1 week after this day in his previous life. The thought sent a pang through his heart, and driven by a force he barely understood, Ghislaine moved to embrace her. Elena, caught off guard, returned his hug hesitantly, while Belinda, standing nearby, looked on in shock, confused by Ghislaine's sudden show of affection. The memories and regrets of his past consumed him, and he felt an almost desperate need to apologize silently for his past distance. Belinda's confused gaze lingered on him, and Ghislaine felt her eyes questioning him, but he continued holding his sister close, unbothered by the awkwardness of the moment. Regret gnawed at him, memories of missed moments and careless words weighing heavily on his mind. In his previous life, he had let pride and anger dictate his actions, often distancing himself from Elena in the process. Now he cursed his former self for the needless walls he'd built between them. As he gently pulled away, Elena looked up at him with a puzzled expression. She was clearly taken aback by this unexpected affection, especially given the harshness he had often shown her before. Her brother, who had once dismissed her with a coldness she couldn't understand, was now acting almost as if he feared losing her. For Ghislaine, each second of this encounter was both a relief and a pang of sorrow, a second chance tinged with the pain of memories that only he carried. Ghislaine couldn't help but feel ashamed for how he had treated her, wondering how he could have failed to see the value of her presence in his life. He had allowed the burdens of his role and his frustrations to blind him to his own family. In that moment, he vowed to himself that he would not squander this opportunity to be a better brother, even if the road ahead demanded every ounce of his strength and resilience. After a while, Elena could sense her brother's genuine remorse, and a gentle smile crept across her face. Ghislaine attempted to assure her that he was fine, though neither Elena nor Belinda seemed to buy his words. When Belinda questioned him about the orc attack, Ghislaine sighed, trying his best to hide the searing pain still coursing through his body. He reassured them both, insisting he was really okay, though his movements were limited by the pain that lingered from the battle. Seeing Elena's smile lightened Ghislaine's heart a little. Reflecting, he wondered why he had once wasted so much time on meaningless things instead of spending it with her. He recalled how, in his previous life, he had declined to go with her to the festival out of frustration and his commitment to the expedition team. That was the last time he'd ever seen her alive. Later, her body and those of her guards had been found, brutally torn apart. Ghislaine couldn't shake the guilt for not being there for his sister during that pivotal moment. Outside, someone knocked on the door and asked if they could enter. A servant announced that Lady Elena had arrived, flanked by her two guards, Jamal on her right and Philip on her left. Elena entered, questioning what was happening and reminding everyone she'd asked them to wait outside. One of the guards explained that the servant had asked Elena to verify the preparations for the festival. Ghislaine was surprised and wondered why Elena was tasked with such responsibilities. One of the guards clarified that Ghislaine had been spending his days playing around, seemingly uninterested in any duties. Ghislaine, deep in thought, realized that he had overlooked the manpower shortage affecting the Perdium family in the past. His younger self had been too detached, disregarding everything around him. Determined to make amends, Ghislaine declared his desire to help Elena, leaving her visibly surprised. She and the guards, Jamal and Philip, exchanged glances of disbelief, suspecting that perhaps he'd truly been struck in the head. Later, in a different location, Ghislaine's voice resonated as he reiterated his intention to assist. Elena, unimpressed, urged him to leave, as his presence seemed to unsettle the others. Unfazed, Ghislaine inwardly questioned her treatment, wondering if this was how she repaid someone earnestly trying to support her. Elena responded calmly, suggesting that the best help he could offer was simply to stay out of trouble. In his mind, memories of Elena's tragic fate resurfaced. Her body had been discovered near a slum, close to the festival grounds. Ghislaine understood that someone had either lured or forced her there. To prevent this tragedy from repeating, he resolved to meticulously track those entering and leaving the city during the upcoming festival. As Fergus hurriedly approached from the distance, his voice echoed with urgency as he called out Ghislaine's name. Hearing his faithful servant's voice, Ghislaine turned slowly to find Fergus running toward him, visibly anxious and out of breath. Relief washed over Fergus as he confirmed Ghislaine was safe, thanking the heavens that his young master had survived. He quickly explained that he had come rushing as soon as he'd heard news of the orc attack. However, Ghislaine, not wanting to draw out the conversation, attempted to cut it short. Before he could say more, Elena interjected with a light-hearted smile, commenting that Fergus had arrived at just the right time. She added, with a hint of mischief, that Ghislaine had been acting strangely since waking and suggested Fergus escort him back to his room. Fergus, ever loyal, nodded in agreement with Elena's request. Privately, Ghislaine considered how Fergus's arrival had once again disrupted his plans. He reluctantly decided to enlist Fergus's help to learn more about the upcoming week's events. Recalling an old, abandoned training ground within the city, Ghislaine requested Fergus to take him there. Although initially startled by the request, Fergus quickly agreed, leading Ghislaine toward the deserted training grounds, where he hoped to gain some clarity and refine his strategy. Standing before the training grounds, Ghislaine took in the scene with a sense of bewilderment. The place was in even better condition than he'd anticipated, making it the perfect spot for his training needs. In his past life as a mercenary, he had never encountered such a well-maintained training ground, and now, realizing its potential, he felt a renewed resolve. Fergus, standing nearby, explained that the grounds had been preserved carefully in anticipation of times when Ghislaine might need it, adding that he always believed one day Ghislaine would find a purpose there. Ghislaine recalled how Fergus had made similar preparations in his previous life, and this realization sparked a determination within him. He recognized that he had a rare chance to make things right, knowing that altering his fate, and that of his family, required him to survive and outlast his enemies. Despite the weariness creeping into his muscles, Ghislaine insisted he had to start training immediately, assuring himself that the physical strain was worth it. He even mused aloud that it felt as if he'd come back from the dead, which drew a sharp look from Fergus. With a smirk, Ghislaine recognized that Fergus's perceptive nature had him almost guessing the truth. Fergus took his young master's words as jest, but still expressed admiration for his resilience. As Fergus turned to leave, Ghislaine instructed him to return home, and Fergus complied, offering a respectful nod before departing. Left alone, Ghislaine's thoughts drifted to the mistakes of his past. He had once treated everyone as adversaries, an approach he now saw as short-sighted. The impending week held immense significance, as it marked the day his sister, Alina, would meet her tragic fate. Her death had been the catalyst for the Perdium family's downfall, sparking a bloody feud with a neighboring lord. If Ghislaine was to alter the course of his family's destiny, he knew he had to address the source of the problem head-on. With renewed resolve, he set his sights on the rigorous training ahead, determined to rewrite his and his family's fate. Ghislaine reflected that his top priority was to become stronger. Unfortunately, time wasn't on his side, yet he knew he could at least learn to control his mana. Mana, an extraordinary energy source, allows a person to surpass human limits. While most people say sensing mana is the hardest step, Ghislaine had managed it, even on the battlefield. He understood that mastering mana involved connecting with particles in the air, swirling them into a solid core. For Ghislaine, who had survived thousands, no, tens of thousands, of battles, forming a mana core was as easy as breathing. But merely stopping there wouldn't make him one of the 7 strongest. Using an ancient method from a magical tome he'd acquired, alongside the natural human mana core, Ghislaine could form 2, even 3 cores. This technique involved linking these cores together to create explosive power. When he drew the mana particles into his body, the pain was excruciating, forcing him to cough up fresh blood. 3 mana cores were his limit now. Although he could handle 5 in the past, this technique allowed him to generate intense power quickly, albeit at the cost of large mana reserves. This was why he'd lost to Aiden in his past life, when the knights attacked him at his weakest, drained of mana. In a fair fight, Ghislaine knew he would have won. While unstable, this technique was enough for now. He was still young, with time to recover and grow stronger. This time he was determined to defeat Aiden and the masked figure responsible for his family's downfall. Ghislaine silently vowed to kill them all. A week later, on the day of the festival, Ghislaine readied his weapon, his gaze focused and intense. As he stepped outside, Alina, noticing the unusual sight, asked if something was wrong. She was surprised. Her brother had never prepared so seriously for an event like this before. Ghislaine calmly replied that, as a member of the Perdium family, he felt obligated to attend the festival. Alina observed that his behavior was indeed strange. She had heard rumors of his rigorous training throughout the week and wondered if something was amiss for a noble heir to suddenly show such interest in combat, something he had always dismissed in the past. As she continued, Alina recalled how Ghislaine used to complain about their father's strict expectations, even wishing to become lord himself to avoid them. Her words left Ghislaine reflective. Internally, he acknowledged that much had shifted over the past week. Through his newfound actions, Ghislaine was already beginning to see the future he was determined to reshape. In the distance, Belinda was busy instructing the guards, reminding them to keep an eye on young Master Ghislaine and ensure he didn't get into any trouble. With the influx of guests, she felt anxious about the potential for things to spiral out of control if anything were to go wrong. Jamal and Philip, the 2 assigned guards, responded confidently, reassuring her that she could rely on them completely. Meanwhile, Ghislaine reflected on how the significant events remained unchanged, yet it was difficult to measure the effects of the smaller actions he had altered. He knew that his top priority was to make the best use of his knowledge of future events to achieve optimal outcomes. Handling each situation as it arose with care was essential. When they reached the designated place, everything was eerily quiet, with no one else in sight. Elena looked around, disappointed, wondering aloud what was happening and why no one was there. She even doubted that anyone would host a performance in such a dingy place. Jamal responded that perhaps the event wasn't ready yet, and that people would arrive soon. Elena, looking unimpressed, remarked that nobody would host a show in a place like this. While Ghislaine carefully surveyed the area, he noted that the quiet street was blocked off with several barriers, and he began to suspect it was a trap. Just as he was lost in thought, Elena unexpectedly grabbed his arm and pulled him along. Jamal suggested they wait a bit longer for the show, but Elena declined, saying she wasn't interested in watching anything here. Ghislaine, surprised by her grip strength, wondered if she had been secretly training, as her hold was quite firm. Suddenly, Elena collided with someone standing directly in their path. Philip stepped in, advising Elena to stay and wait a bit longer. Ghislaine noticed that Jamal and Philip's behavior seemed increasingly strange and began to wonder what was really going on with them. The man before them then spoke calmly, clarifying that he hadn't meant to alarm Elena but simply had a reasonable request. Ghislaine sensed something was amiss, wondering what that request might be. As Ghislaine listened to the ominous footsteps echoing from afar, he realized the impending danger. He turned with the others to find a group of mysterious individuals steadily advancing toward them. Leading the group was a man named Frank, who taunted Ghislaine by remarking on his efficiency. He casually addressed his accomplices, noting that they had fulfilled their end of the bargain by bringing the young lady as promised, signaling it was time to complete their deal. However, Frank's expression shifted when he spotted Ghislaine, who hadn't been part of the arrangement. With a mocking grin, he pointed out that while Elena was their primary target, Ghislaine's unexpected appearance would merely be an added bonus. He ridiculed Ghislaine, noting he had unwittingly walked right into their trap, and that this isolated area would serve as his grave. Seething with anger, Ghislaine broke his silence and confronted Jamal, accusing him of betraying them. Jamal sneered in response, asking Ghislaine if he genuinely believed he could escape from this situation. He continued to justify his betrayal, expressing disdain for the impoverished life in Podium and a longing to escape to a better place, something he insisted many others shared. But before Jamal could finish his speech, Ghislaine acted. In a flash, he moved with astonishing speed, his sword driving deep into Jamal's body. The sheer swiftness of Ghislaine's retaliation left everyone in shock. Jamal, struggling to grasp his own weapon, was quickly silenced as Ghislaine delivered a final blow, piercing his head. Jamal's disbelief was evident as he collapsed lifelessly to the ground, leaving those around to witness the sudden turn of events in stunned silence. Witnessing this display, the group of mysterious onlookers couldn't hide their shock, remarking aloud that Ghislaine truly lived up to the name of Podium's eldest. They hadn't expected him to be so formidable in combat, especially given his unassuming appearance. Frank echoed their sentiments, noting that while they had momentarily let their guard down, Ghislaine had taken full advantage, dispatching two knights effortlessly with his mana-infused attacks. Elena, still processing the scene, looked to Ghislaine in bewilderment, clearly struggling to understand the abrupt turn of events. Without a word, Ghislaine gently rendered her unconscious, allowing her to rest and remain safe from what was about to unfold. One of the group's members stepped forward, laughing coldly and sarcastically thanking Ghislaine for taking care of their job. He acknowledged that Ghislaine was different from what they had been told and admitted that they had planned to deal with both siblings themselves. In his mind, Ghislaine assessed the threat level of each person, realizing that, while the two flanking figures posed minimal danger, the individual in the center emitted an aura of mana on an entirely different level. Ghislaine knew he would have to act quickly and decisively to bring this encounter to an end. Ghislaine turned his gaze to Frank, demanding sharply to know who had ordered this attack. Frank merely sneered, dismissing the question with a taunting remark that it was meaningless information, especially now that Ghislaine's father was dead. His tone dripped with smugness, suggesting that Ghislaine would eventually beg to know the truth, though Frank doubted he'd reveal it willingly. One of Frank's henchmen asked if they should simply decapitate Ghislaine to end the matter swiftly. Frank rejected this, preferring to capture Ghislaine alive. He intended to cripple him, severing each limb to leave him writhing in agony, a fitting end, he thought. As two of Frank's men charged forward, Ghislaine's eyes glinted with a steely resolve. He swiftly drew a weapon he had prepared, throwing it directly at the pair. One of the henchmen mistook the attack as mere fireworks, allowing Ghislaine to teleport in an instant, thrusting his blade into the man's head before he could react. The other opponent attempted a stealth attack, maneuvering to strike Ghislaine from behind. However, Ghislaine anticipated this, countering with a swift sword block, capturing his opponent's weapon mid-air. With a powerful twist, he disarmed his adversary and, in a single, precise movement, cleaved his enemy's head, ending the ambush in mere moments. In the tense silence that followed, Ghislaine's sharp instincts kept him alert, prepared for any further threat. His experience in battle, combined with his relentless determination, had left the attackers stunned and unable to continue. As Frank made his surprise attack from behind, Ghislaine quickly spun around, intercepting the blow just in time. Frank's shock was palpable. He hadn't expected Ghislaine to counter his perfect ambush. Ghislaine, wasting no time, countered with a precise slash aimed at Frank's neck. Though the strike landed, Frank's neck remained unharmed, with only a faint cut marking the skin. Smirking, Frank mocked that if it hadn't been for his mana shield, Ghislaine's blow might have been fatal. Realizing the mana reinforcement around Frank's neck, Ghislaine's suspicions grew regarding his opponent's strength. Frank continued to taunt him, scoffing at Ghislaine's meager mana reserves and claiming that his unorthodox fighting style would get him nowhere. Ghislaine, unfazed by Frank's threats, responded with a cold, mocking smile. Frank, irritated by Ghislaine's defiance, was caught off guard when Ghislaine suddenly thrust his sword into the ground and delivered a powerful kick to Frank's face, sending him stumbling back. Dismissing Ghislaine's strength, Frank confidently sneered, but his confidence quickly faded as he coughed up blood, realizing Ghislaine's unexpected strength had pierced his defenses. Bewildered, Frank wondered how Ghislaine's blow had breached his mana barrier. Unmoved by Frank's confusion, Ghislaine revealed his intent, subtly hinting that he suspected Frank to be behind Alina's death. He readied himself, pushing his limits to activate his third mana core. Frank watched in disbelief as Ghislaine's mana flared intensely, his power now far surpassing Frank's expectations. With renewed intensity, Ghislaine attacked, his strike so powerful that Frank could barely keep up, fighting for his life against Ghislaine's relentless assault. As Ghislaine unleashed a devastating strike on Frank, his sword cut deep, leaving Frank visibly shaken as he struggled to keep up with Ghislaine's sheer force. Frank, despite drawing all the mana he could muster, realized there was a limit to his defenses. He found himself bewildered by Ghislaine's overwhelming strength, as if he were facing an entirely different person. When Frank's sword shattered under the pressure of Ghislaine's relentless assault, Ghislaine seized the opportunity, delivering another brutal blow that left a deep wound. Ghislaine's blade pierced Frank's abdomen, leaving him coughing up blood and weakening by the second. Locking eyes with his adversary, Ghislaine demanded the truth, questioning who had orchestrated the attack. Desperately clinging to the hope of taking Alina down with him, Frank's thoughts turned vengeful. But as he moved to act, red threads appeared out of nowhere, binding his arms tightly. Ghislaine's voice cut through the air, cold and unyielding, instructing Frank to stop resisting an answer, promising he would withdraw his blade if he complied. Frank stared in shock, his mind racing to understand the origin of the red threads binding him. He couldn't fathom how Ghislaine had conjured such restraints with mana, or when he'd even prepared for this. His frustration mounted as he tried to struggle free, only to realize his body refused to obey. Memories flashed in Frank's mind as Ghislaine's cold voice echoed, warning him that while Frank could likely heal his own injuries, it would be another matter if Ghislaine shattered his mana core. This threat sent a chill through Frank, who had never considered the possibility of losing his core. Before he could form a response, Ghislaine pushed his sword deeper, twisting it slightly, forcing Frank into agony. Frank cried out, his mana scattering wildly throughout his body, destabilized and out of control. Frank screamed, accusing Ghislaine of madness, warning that any slight mistake could trigger an explosive mana backlash that would obliterate them both. Ghislaine, however, remained completely unfazed. A smirk tugged at his lips as he dismissed Frank's threats, suggesting that only the unskilled would struggle to control such a situation. With chilling confidence, he asserted that he had complete mastery over the flow of mana. In that moment, Frank's terror transformed into despair as he realized that Ghislaine was not only calm but wielded a control and precision over mana that far surpassed his own, marking him as a truly formidable opponent. Frank, now overtaken by panic, finally realized that Ghislaine's threat was no bluff. His life truly hung in the balance. Seeing no other option, he reluctantly confessed that Count Desmond was the mastermind behind the plot. Desmond had ordered him to set up this ambush, hoping to spark a war between the Perdium family and House de Gaulle. As he absorbed this information, Ghislaine's mind raced through the implications. He recognized that Desmond, like others who allied with Duke Delphine, had relied on the shadows to orchestrate these ruthless tactics. Still, he couldn't shake the lingering pain over Alina's death. Even with Desmond's confession, Ghislaine felt an emptiness gnawing at him, as if this revelation did nothing to ease the ache or the sense of betrayal. He wondered why Desmond would risk instigating conflict without clear support from Duke Delphine himself, fueling more questions about the motives hidden within the twisted alliances. Yet, even as he processed Frank's admission, the thought of Alina's tragic fate left a bitter weight in his chest, intensifying his resolve to uncover the full truth. As Frank's final words left his mouth, Ghislaine showed no hesitation, driving his blade straight through Frank's abdomen. The shock and pain etched across Frank's face as he struggled to question Ghislaine's actions, a stark contrast to the ruthless facade he'd worn up until that moment. Yet Ghislaine, unfazed, responded coldly, reminding Frank of the lives he'd taken so easily. Frank, managing a twisted smile, retorted that his death would change nothing. He boasted that his dealings with Degald were already sealed, mocking Ghislaine by claiming that no one would believe a word he said. The inevitable war would consume them all. Unmoved by Frank's taunts, Ghislaine reaffirmed his resolve, stating that this time, things would be different. He was reborn, armed with the knowledge of what was to come. Channeling his mana, he cast an intense burst of energy that shot skyward, exploding like fireworks over the desolate scene. In the eerie light, Frank's body shattered, leaving nothing but fragments. Exhausted from the ordeal, Ghislaine looked down at the aftermath surrounding him, his gaze finally settling on Alina. With a wave of fatigue washing over him, he released his grip on his weapon, coughing up blood from the strain of his fight. As Ghislaine mentally berated himself, he couldn't help but recall that back in his days as the Mercenary King, detonating 3 mana cores was a trivial feat. Now, however, he felt his strength waning, his body pushed beyond its limits. Determined not to falter, he steeled himself and bolted towards another room with all the speed he could muster. Kicking the door open, Ghislaine's mind flashed back to his past life. In this very spot, they had once discovered another lifeless body alongside Alina's. Given Frank's recent revelations, Ghislaine pieced together that the son of Degald had been murdered here, alongside his knight, as a cruel attempt to silence witnesses and frame others for Alina's death. He realized this setup would inevitably lead to conflict and resolved not to let events play out as Frank had orchestrated. In the shadows, a mysterious figure retreated, slipping silently into the darkness. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a group was gathered, their voices laced with frustration over their failure. One muttered bitterly, noting how they had sent their finest, including knights and Frank himself, yet they still couldn't succeed. Another, with contempt, questioned how they could possibly fail against someone like Ghislaine, dismissing him as nothing more than a kid. The man leading the group responded sharply, pointing out that all their plans had been ruined by Ghislaine. Another member, visibly shocked, exclaimed that they never would have believed Ghislaine, the useless waste from the north, was capable of such feats. He expressed disbelief, realizing now that all their intel and rumors had been completely off the mark. Visions of Ghislaine's prowess in battle flashed through their minds, recalling his powerful and relentless techniques. Each move of Ghislaine's had been calculated and effective, effortlessly dismantling his opponents one by one. The leader continued, observing that Ghislaine seemed like an entirely different person, a version they hadn't anticipated. Still, he assured the others that their business with the Degald family was complete, so there was no longer a need to worry about starting a war over the Perdium lands. Yet, one of the group's members pleaded for one more chance to redeem himself. At that, a voice cut through with fury, demanding silence. The leader berated him, calling out his incompetence in failing such a simple mission and his negligence in underestimating Ghislaine. He asserted that the failure had caused too many obstacles and insisted that no further chances were warranted if this member couldn't handle even the most basic objectives. When the leader inquired about this opponent's identity, the man declared the name Cain Rogues, a figure famed for his brute strength and swordsmanship. Cain had earned a reputation as a symbol of raw power in the north, unmatched by anyone in the region. Additionally, Cain shared family ties with Ghislaine, making it unnecessary to force an encounter between the two. The room fell silent upon hearing this plan, each attendee contemplating the weight of such a matchup. The leader then issued a stern warning, stating that if this attempt failed, there would be no further chances. The man, unfazed, confidently reassured the leader that he would not disappoint him. Ghislaine simply explained to Fergus that he was using mana as a sort of thread to control objects with precision. Reflecting on his past life, Ghislaine recalled using this technique at an advanced level, though now he had to be mindful of his reduced mana reserves, adjusting his methods to conserve energy. Fergus, unable to hide his surprise, remarked that, despite his own years of mana training, he'd never seen a technique like this. Astonished, he noted how just days prior Ghislaine had been unable to manipulate mana at all. Now, through his own practice, Ghislaine had developed an entirely unique method of control. Ghislaine, seemingly unfazed by Fergus's thoughts, only asked him what he wanted. Fergus then expressed his genuine gratitude, explaining he'd come primarily to thank Ghislaine for protecting the young lady, Elena. Ghislaine, a bit surprised by Fergus's gratitude, dismissed it as merely something he was supposed to do. Wrapping up the exchange, Fergus then suggested they go share a meal. This exchange highlighted the shift in Ghislaine's abilities and Fergus's growing admiration, adding subtle warmth to their bond. It was an acknowledgement of Ghislaine's growth, both in skill and responsibility. A few days later, the festival was temporarily halted due to the discovery of a knight's scheme to sell off the young lady. Elena recounted to Ghislaine that no one believed her when she insisted it was he who had saved her. Curious, she asked what he planned to tell everyone. Ghislaine, keeping his cool, replied calmly that it didn't matter, no one would believe it either way. Belinda, overhearing the conversation, interjected angrily, declaring that Yama and Philip were the true traitors. Unable to contain her fury, she went so far as to call them twisted fiends. Elena only sighed at her friend's outburst, gently cautioning her to lower her voice. Ghislaine, meanwhile, found himself reflecting on the fact that Elena was alive and that he'd successfully prevented the war from breaking out. Yet he knew that the forces behind this plot wouldn't give up so easily. Realizing that he couldn't handle this looming threat alone forever, he knew he'd have to build an army. But for this to succeed, Ghislaine recognized that he would need to master political maneuvers. His eyes shifted focus as he noticed the neatly arranged dishes before them. Turning to Belinda, he inquired why they were being served dessert first, catching her off guard. Just then, a loud shout from outside interrupted, demanding compensation from losses incurred due to the cancelled festival. This series of events highlighted Ghislaine's strategic shift toward building alliances and influence, a far cry from his former life, and hinted at the many challenges yet to come. The man who had just shouted for compensation repeatedly accused Ghislaine of hoarding money, making his demands louder with each moment. Though some tried to keep their composure, Ghislaine could tell that this simmering anger was not going to dissipate easily. They argued that many merchants relied on festival profits, and canceling it so abruptly had created significant frustration among the locals. Realizing how serious things had gotten, Ghislaine knew that unless something was done, this crowd's anger would only intensify. He asked Fergus about the presence of any guards to manage the situation. However, Fergus replied that there were none left to calm the crowd. Fergus tried to explain that most of the guards had been dispatched to the monster forest to begin reconstruction following the orc attack. Frustrated, Ghislaine recognized the grave reality: all the remaining troops had been pulled away, leaving Perdium defenseless. With constant threats from northern barbarians and monsters around the fortress, as well as the ever-looming danger in the monster forest, the situation had quickly become untenable, especially with no funds and no soldiers. Ghislaine knew he would have to find a way to control both the crowd and the worsening external threats, all while navigating the delicate political landscape that had left his family vulnerable. This was no longer just a matter of silencing a few angry merchants. He needed a long-term strategy to secure the region's stability and protect the people who depended on him. Ghislaine led Belinda to a quieter corner, his expression serious as he reminded her of her role in managing his finances and requested that she access any remaining funds to address the demands of the angry merchants. However, to his surprise, Belinda responded with a note of frustration, confirming that there was, in fact, no money left in his account. She reminded him that his financial support had been completely cut off by the Count due to his previous extravagant spending. Shocked, Ghislaine struggled to comprehend the implications. Not only had he run out of funds, but he also lacked the necessary guards to secure the area. Despite his knowledge from the future and his intentions to change the fate of his family, Ghislaine now faced the harsh reality that he was nearly powerless without resources. He wondered how he could stabilize the situation and avoid any further escalation. As these thoughts weighed on him, the door swung open, and Ricardo, his trusted guard, rushed in with a sense of urgency. Ricardo, breathless from his haste, reported that Cain Rogues had arrived and was insisting on meeting with him. Ghislaine's eyes widened with both surprise and apprehension. In the next scene, a powerful punch lands squarely on Skovan's chest, leaving a brutal imprint as he staggers back. Just as the dust settles, Ghislaine arrives, his face a mask of icy calm as he surveys the tense standoff before him. A voice from nearby sneers, noting with a hint of sarcasm that the main character has finally decided to show up. Cain Rogues smirks, his gaze fixed intently on Ghislaine, and he silently bets that his opponent's pride won't let him resist the provocation. Ghislaine, thrown off, asks what he's referring to. Cain leans in with a smug expression, reminding Ghislaine of the cancelled festivities, daring him to bring the excitement back to life. Ghislaine recalls Kane's relentless demands for wine and entertainment on past visits, demands he'd once obliged to keep the peace. But this time, the same look of quiet rebellion settles over his face. He no longer intends to play by Kane's rules. Kane, observing this subtle shift, braces himself, knowing that he might have finally forced Ghislaine into action. Kane's taunts escalated, but Ghislaine's gaze changed suddenly as he recognized an opportunity. Ignoring Kane's demands for him to deliver what was promised, Ghislaine countered with a sharp declaration that Kane had a debt to repay. Taken aback, Kane questioned him and Ghislaine made it clear Kane owed him 1,000 gold pieces, principal plus interest, for all the expenses he'd racked up. Kane protested, laughing incredulously, saying those costs weren't worth more than 100 gold at most. But Ghislaine, unyielding, pointed out that their so-called friendship was little more than Kane using him as a doormat and demanded repayment, saying he needed the funds urgently, something Kane was well aware of. The challenge in Ghislaine's voice prompted a shift in Kane's expression, now cold and calculated. He rose, slamming his foot down, and with a sneer, berated Ghislaine for his audacity, implying that he had only grown bold because of Kane's past leniency. Kane continued, belittling Ghislaine's supposed achievements, dismissing them as mere gossip about beating a knight. He spat that Ghislaine was nothing more than a parasite clinging to this land, a sentiment, Kane noted, shared by others in the north. With rising aggression, Kane aimed a punch directly at Ghislaine. Yet, Ghislaine evaded in an instant, his reflexes too swift for Kane, leaving onlookers astonished. Kane pressed his assault, but Ghislaine responded swiftly, landing a powerful punch into Kane's stomach, forcing him to cough up blood. Unrelenting, Ghislaine readied another strike, but this time Kane managed to block, only to collapse to the ground once more, spewing blood with the impact. Ghislaine's resolve only grew as he observed the crowd's disbelief. A concerned guard asked if Ghislaine was all right, but he brushed off the concern, stating confidently that Kane could endure more and would rise again. Around them, murmurs of disbelief rippled through the audience. Many found it hard to believe that Ghislaine had indeed overpowered Kane, the notorious warrior. Smiling inwardly, Ghislaine understood that Kane intended to stage a public scene, and he was prepared to play along. Meanwhile, Kane, hiding his own irritation, whispered to his guard, asking how convincing his performance appeared. The guard reassured him with a smirk, acknowledging that Kane had set the stage perfectly. The scene painted Ghislaine as the instigator, fostering the perfect conditions for an official duel. This facade aligned with Kane's deeper strategy. He knew this duel could be his gateway to garnering powerful backing against Perdium. Kane's thoughts lingered on the promises made to him. If he successfully completed this mission, the influential houses backing him would provide formidable support. He knew the timing was right to exploit Perdium's weakening state. Kane's ambition soared as he envisioned this encounter as a pivotal step to cementing the rogue's power and reputation. Kane, consumed by anger, bellowed at Ghislaine, accusing him of tarnishing noble honor with lies and challenging his motives for striking him. Kane continued, with a tone thick with scorn, demanding a duel to settle the matter. However, before Kane could make the customary gesture by tossing his own glove, Ghislaine preemptively threw his glove, striking Kane's face. With unwavering resolve, Ghislaine formally challenged Kane to a duel, citing his insults to Perdium's heir and accusations against Kane's attacks on his knight. He underscored that rejecting this duel would be impossible for Kane. Kane's face darkened before breaking into a mocking laugh. He sneered, claiming that Ghislaine was foolish enough to walk into his own demise. Kane accepted the challenge with chilling confidence, warning Ghislaine that whatever the outcome, regret was no longer an option. Ghislaine, unfazed by Kane's bravado, smiled to himself and signaled Ricardo to make preparations for the duel. Ghislaine couldn't help but notice that the delayed festival had left eager attendees restless and unsatisfied. He mused that a spectacle like their duel would be the perfect outlet for the crowd's unspent energy. As the referee announced the impending duel between Kane and Ghislaine, excitement rippled through the gathering. Bets poured in favor of Kane, and spectators eagerly anticipated the chance to see the Perdium heir put to the test against the fierce and infamous Kane. As the duel began, Kane plunged his sword into the ground, frustration simmering as the sacred match morphed into a spectacle. He declared that even if Ghislaine surrendered, his blade wouldn't show mercy. Ghislaine sensed Kane's true intentions, and with a quick nod to the crowd, signaled for the battle to start. At that moment, Kane's guard interjected, pointing out the impossibility of placing bets under such conditions. The crowd shifted uneasily. No one was willing to bet on Ghislaine. Observers had all but decided the duel's outcome, certain Kane would emerge victorious. Some murmured about changing the stakes to see how long Ghislaine could hold his ground against Kane, drawing a subtle smile from Ghislaine as wagers increased, fueling anticipation. One spectator went further, betting on the mere duration of Ghislaine's endurance, surprising the onlookers as another stack of coins was added before the referee. With this unexpected twist, the crowd's excitement surged, realizing the bout's influence had already grown beyond expectations. Lady Elena stood at the edge of the arena, her gaze filled with concern as she watched Ghislaine prepare for the duel. With a determined nod, she signaled that the arrangements were complete. Beside her, Belinda expressed her reservations once more, reminding Elena that she had cautioned against this course of action. However, Elena remained resolute, her eyes fixed on Ghislaine. The referee called out, verifying that everything was ready. Ghislaine glanced toward Kane, reminding him that as the elder, it would be unseemly for him to strike first. But before Kane could respond, Ghislaine drew his sword, testing his arm with a decisive, sweeping slash. Kane, noting the intensity in Ghislaine's gaze, scoffed and remarked that it was far too late to play the elder role now. The duel commenced. Kane leaped high into the air, bringing his blade down toward Ghislaine with fierce strength. With a mocking tone, Kane commented on the lengths he had gone to preserve Ghislaine's pride. He followed his attack with a powerful strike, sending Ghislaine skidding backward. Though Ghislaine swiftly evaded the assault, using his nimble frame to his advantage, Kane seized the moment, stomping down on the ground with a forceful blow. The crowd watched in hushed anticipation, sensing that this was no ordinary match but a clash of wills and pride. The crowd murmured in amazement, convinced that Ghislaine wouldn't withstand another blow. Kane, catching these remarks, smirked with satisfaction. Ghislaine's expression remained calm, quietly assessing that Kane's usual tactic was now apparent. Kane always relied on overwhelming his opponents with raw power, manipulating them into believing they were too weak to counter. Once they exhausted themselves, he would strike the final blow. Seizing the upper hand, Kane hurled his sword at Ghislaine, but deftly caught it by its hilt mid-flight, taunting Ghislaine about his supposed skill in dodging. The force sent Ghislaine sprawling, igniting the spectators' excitement as they declared the duel over, certain that Ghislaine had been defeated. Yet, just before hitting the ground, Ghislaine channeled mana into his legs, stabilizing himself and regaining his footing. Ghislaine's inner resolve solidified. He had intended to go easy on Kane, but Kane's unrestrained aggression crossed the line. In a swift motion, Ghislaine teleported back, landing a sharp strike on Kane, leaving him momentarily stunned. Kane realized with astonishment that Ghislaine had mastered the balance-restoring technique, a skill reserved for elite swordsmen. Though shaken, Kane attempted to maintain his arrogant front, believing his raw strength would still intimidate Ghislaine. But Ghislaine, unfazed, coldly asserted that he would make Kane see clearly. Kane faced tense with defiance, sneered and demanded to know how Ghislaine intended to do so. With a sharp pivot, Ghislaine struck Kane's sword with a powerful kick, throwing him off balance. Then, taking advantage of the moment, Ghislaine leaped up, planted his foot on Kane's arm, and with a 360-degree spin in midair, landed a fierce slash across Kane's body. Enraged, Kane lunged forward, but Ghislaine swiftly dodged, stomping down on Kane's sword and pinning it to the ground. With a quick movement, Ghislaine's weapon grazed Kane's neck, leaving a series of shallow cuts across his skin. The crowd erupted in astonishment, whispering about Ghislaine's improved skills and the possibility of his victory. Elena, observing from the sidelines, exhaled with satisfaction, expressing her confidence in Ghislaine's success. Kane's guard, nervously sweating, watched the scene unfold with mounting anxiety. Meanwhile, Kane himself seethed, perplexed as to why Ghislaine's strikes only left shallow wounds, as if intentionally holding back. Maintaining an unyielding gaze, Ghislaine threw his sword aside, implying that the skill gap between them made continuing with weapons pointless. He calmly announced that he would now fight bare-handed, igniting Kane's fury. Ghislaine, unfazed, remarked that he would use this chance to teach Kane, explaining that since Kane struggled with swordsmanship, he would handicap himself to make it fairer. He added a further challenge, wagering an additional 2,000 gold on his own victory. The shift in Ghislaine's approach, from weapon combat to hand, both stunned and riled the crowd, heightening the stakes of the showdown and making Ghislaine's confidence in his abilities unmistakable. The crowd grew restless, divided in opinion as Ghislaine and Kane squared off, unarmed on one side and armed on the other. Whispers rippled through the spectators. Some scoffed at Ghislaine's decision to fight bare-handed, seeing it as reckless, while others admired his audacity, choosing to place bets on him. The energy in the crowd fluctuated between sneers, scoffs, and a few lingering notes of hope. Kane, sneering, accepted Ghislaine's challenge on his own terms, casting off his jacket to reveal a powerful, intimidating physique. With a smirk, he insisted Ghislaine arm himself, raising his sword with an air of finality. Yet, Ghislaine ignored this goad, resolute in his bare-knuckled approach. As Cain lunged with his sword, Ghislaine sidestepped, weaving through Cain's attacks with deft agility. Cain's foot flew out in a kick, only to meet empty air as Ghislaine danced out of range. In a quick counter, Ghislaine delivered a sharp punch to Cain's leg, then pivoted with a powerful jab to Cain's face, the impact sending blood splattering. Cain staggered, visibly shaken, unable to conceal his shock at Ghislaine's speed and strength. The crowd erupted with a mixture of gasps and murmurs, eyes glued to the duel as Cain, humiliated and dazed, lay briefly stunned on the ground, contemplating his next move against an opponent who was rapidly shattering all his expectations. The crowd surrounding the arena burst into murmurs of astonishment, unable to believe that Ghislaine was holding his own and, remarkably, even outmatching Cain. Ghislaine stood tall, projecting confidence as he declared that he hadn't even begun to fight in earnest, an assertion that made Cain grit his teeth in fury. Fueled by frustration, Cain channeled every ounce of his strength into relentless strikes. However, Ghislaine moved like a shadow, deftly evading each blow, his calm composure fueling Cain's growing desperation. Inwardly, Ghislaine noted Cain's inability to meet his gaze, a sign of weakness and hesitation. Memories of his mission resurfaced, sharpening his focus. He was not merely fighting for his own pride, but to eliminate threats to his family's future. Determined, he rained a series of precise, unyielding punches on Cain, battering his defenses until Cain's resistance finally crumbled. As Cain collapsed to the ground, bruised and winded, Ghislaine voiced his disappointment, expressing dismay that Cain's father, Count Delphine, had once sacrificed nearly everything to support the Perdium family, even when it strained his own resources. Ghislaine reminded Cain that his father had acted out of loyalty to Ghislaine's father, yet Cain had betrayed that legacy. This struck a nerve, and Cain's face registered a flicker of shock as he recalled his own anger years ago, anger that had consumed him when his father had helped the Perdians despite their own struggles. Ghislaine's final blow landed squarely, his fist raised high, and Cain, out of options, closed his eyes, bracing himself. Ghislaine then lowered his fist, declaring that the lesson had been served, and waited for Cain to rise. Cain, humbled and defeated, eventually bowed his head, conceding his loss. The spectators gasped in disbelief as the once feared Cain accepted his failure. His guard, drenched in nervous sweat, stood by helplessly as the crowd erupted in cheers, some celebrating their newfound winnings from the surprise outcome. From the crowd, Cain's aide hurried forward, eyes wide with disbelief, demanding an explanation as to why Cain would surrender so readily, all over what seemed like a mere misstep. As Elena interjects, she mentions Amelia from the Rapold family, evoking memories in Ghislaine of Amelia, a noblewoman admired for her kindness and unbiased manner. Over time, however, she transforms into the leader of a rebellion, eventually earning the moniker Witch of the North. As she and Duke Delphine chant the hymn of Perdium's downfall, marking them as traitors. Curious about his father's return, Ghislaine asks Belinda, who estimates his arrival in about a week, which Ghislaine deems sufficient to ready himself for the trip to Rapold's territory. He resolves that the journey would be more meaningful if he could arrange financial support himself. The scene shifts to Amelia, setting down her shoes and announcing that if anyone must go barefoot in her city, it would be her. The guards comply, distributing food and shelter to the people, who thank her, calling her name with admiration. Amelia's guard comments on how her compassion has won the people's loyalty, a factor that could advantage her in the impending inheritance dispute. In response, Amelia, slightly pensive, lightly reprimands him with a tap to the face, cautioning him against weakness. When Amelia inquires about the Trade Guild, her guard updates her that the Actium Guild is acquiring materials to rebuild a forward base in the Monster Forest, half of which was destroyed in recent orc attacks near Perdium. Satisfied with the guild's progress, Amelia instructs them to maintain their covert guise as a simple trade guild until they're fully prepared, emphasizing that their true identity must remain hidden. The butler cautiously approaches, delivering his message with measured words, informing Amelia that Lady Ghislaine has arrived unannounced. Amelia's expression hardens at the mention of her guest, and she questions the butler with a sharp gaze, finding the timing of Ghislaine's visit too close to her birthday to be coincidental. As she enters the reception room, Ghislaine sits awaiting her, greeting her with an aloof smile and deliberately casual posture, signaling his disregard for conventional courtesies. Amelia, maintaining her composure, remarks pointedly about his lack of notice and expects an explanation. Ghislaine, entirely undisturbed, replies with a smug tone that he's brought her an early gift, describing it as something unique he sourced from the guild outside their usual territories. Intrigued yet cautious, Amelia asks for more details, to which Ghislaine responds by casually mentioning the guild's name, Actium. Her expression sharpens at this, her gaze turning cold as she scrutinizes him. Ghislaine appears to take notice, offering her a faint smile, as if to acknowledge the weight of his words. With her suspicions aroused, Amelia rises, calmly accepting the gift but cutting their meeting short, demanding Ghislaine's immediate departure. She firmly adds that his intentions won't be forgotten, signaling the underlying tension that has emerged between them. He remained unfazed by her initial dismissal, choosing instead to lean forward and request a loan of 10,000 gold coins, clarifying that this was a personal need, separate from Count Perdium. Amelia narrowed her eyes slightly, her gaze assessing his intent. It was clear Ghislaine's unexpected request was strategic, possibly testing the waters of her plans for the impending power struggle within the Raypold family. Keeping her expression steady, Amelia addressed him with a measured tone, ensuring that Ghislaine understood her stance on maintaining discretion. Any detail concerning Raypold's succession was a tightly guarded secret, she emphasized, and she would tolerate no slip-ups that could jeopardize her preparations. Ghislaine seemed briefly unsettled but resumed his inscrutable demeanor, likely reassessing his initial assumptions about her role. Just then, Bernarf entered, his intense gaze highlighting the gravity of the discussion. Known for his fierce loyalty and combat prowess comparable to the Northern Swordmaster, his presence underscored Amelia's guarded position. While Amelia maintained a composed front, Ghislaine acknowledged the danger in the situation, calmly remarking that his death here could trigger a territorial war one Amelia might find difficult to contain. Unmoved, she met his gaze coldly, firmly asserting that if trouble emerged, word would spread only of an intruder dispatched by her guards. With that, Bernarf subtly adjusted his grip on his weapon, ready to defend Amelia without hesitation. Ghislaine observed the tension mounting in the room, preparing himself for any escalation, realizing that every step now required the utmost caution. Ghislaine unleashed a powerful strike, his arm swinging high above his head. Kane, with no other option, closed his eyes and braced himself for the blow. The force of Ghislaine's punch roared through the air, creating a loud explosion. At that moment, a tall man appeared, standing with an imposing presence. His eyes seemed to spark with fiery intensity. Ghislaine smirked, quickly assessing the situation and recognizing the man's intent to launch a surprise attack. As Ghislaine noticed the figure, he raised an eyebrow. He couldn't help but think to himself that this was likely an assassin, feigning courtesy as a cover for a sudden ambush. He reminded himself that he was no longer someone easily deceived, especially by opponents hiding their attacks behind politeness. Amelia's bodyguard showed clear displeasure, quietly muttering to himself about the poor treatment being offered. With deliberate force, he swung his sword toward Ghislaine, the strike tearing through the air like a storm. Ghislaine swiftly dodged the attack, thinking it ironic how lacking in hospitality his opponent's actions were. Despite evading the blow, Ghislaine felt frustration building as he observed the bodyguard's movements, which were as swift and elusive as a shadow. His irritation was clear as he questioned to himself whether Raypold had any sense of restraint. Although annoyed by the man's lack of respect, Ghislaine couldn't help but acknowledge his opponent's impressive combat skills. The bodyguard, however, remained composed and unbothered by Ghislaine's apparent frustration. He maintained a cold demeanor, reflecting on how it was Ghislaine himself who had shown disrespect by arriving unannounced and disturbing Amelia. To him, there was nothing commendable about such behavior, and his sharp gaze conveyed his readiness for another strike. Without hesitation, the bodyguard concluded that there was no need for politeness when dealing with someone like Ghislaine. Channeling his resolve, he swung his sword once again, the force of his attack splitting the air around him. Though Ghislaine managed to dodge the blade with agility, a faint cut on his arm served as a reminder of the bodyguard's lethal precision. With a powerful swing, Ghislaine launched a counterattack, his sharp blade slicing through the air. The bodyguard reacted instantly, dodging the strike with practiced agility. Neither of them showed any signs of hesitation as they fought fiercely, their movements reflecting the skill of experienced warriors. The tension in the room grew heavier with each exchange as every attack became increasingly lethal. The room descended into chaos as Ghislaine and the bodyguard clashed violently. Ghislaine quickly gained the upper hand, his relentless strikes forcing his opponent onto the defensive. However, as he prepared for his next move, he stumbled and fell to the ground, leaving himself vulnerable. Seizing the opportunity, the bodyguard moved to counterattack. Ghislaine managed to stagger back to his feet, his cold eyes locked onto his opponent. His unwavering gaze radiated determination, and the bodyguard, sensing the shift in Ghislaine's demeanor, realized there was no longer room for hesitation. Preparing himself, the bodyguard steeled his resolve, ready for the next assault. The bodyguard internally mocked Ghislaine at first, recalling the rumors about the young swordsman's lack of practical skill. However, as the fight unfolded, he quickly recognized his mistake. Ghislaine's youth belied his considerable experience and prowess. far surpassing what the bodyguard had expected. Standing tall once more, Ghislaine raised his sword with calculated precision. A satisfied smile crept across his face as he assessed his opponent. He concluded silently that the bodyguard was no novice, contrary to what he had initially thought. Confidence gleamed in his eyes as he prepared for the next exchange. From the shadows, Elena stepped into view, her presence commanding attention. She scanned the chaotic scene and, upon recognizing Bernaf struggling against Ghislaine, felt disbelief rise within her. The sight of the confrontation left her momentarily stunned, questioning why Bernaf would be engaged in such a battle. Bernaf's focus wavered when he heard Elena's voice. Her cold, decisive tone cut through the room as she reminded him of his role. She demanded immediate action, instructing him to bring her Ghislaine's head as proof of his loyalty. Her piercing gaze and unyielding authority left no room for argument. A shiver ran through Bernaf as Elena's words echoed in his mind. He silently accepted her command, knowing the weight it carried. Tightening his grip on his sword, he fixed his eyes on Ghislaine, vowing silently to fulfill her expectations. Without hesitation, he prepared for the decisive confrontation ahead. Ghislaine stood firm, his eyes brimming with confidence and mockery. He exuded disdain as he regarded Bernaf, silently questioning how a mere escort knight could dare to issue orders to him. The thought amused him, and a smirk crossed his face as he relished the obvious disparity in their abilities. Bernaf caught the provocation in Ghislaine's tone, the mocking words clearly aimed to undermine him. He glanced upward briefly, his voice steady as he responded. Though his words carried an edge of frustration, they also held resolve. He acknowledged that he had tried to offer Ghislaine a way out, but if the man insisted on defiance, he would have no choice but to continue their confrontation. The two faced each other, their tension palpable. The air seemed to hum with the unspoken understanding that this would be no ordinary duel. Both their swords gleamed in the dim light, poised for a life-or-death clash. Ghislaine observed Bernaf coolly, deciding to humor him. He announced his intention to comply, though his tone carried an unmistakable edge of sarcasm. With a calculated movement, he raised his sword, signaling his readiness to strike. The battle began with explosive speed. Bernaf launched an aggressive strike, his blades slicing through the air and generating a sharp gust. Ghislaine dodged the attack with fluid precision, never losing focus. Every movement was deliberate, each step measured. As the battle raged, Ghislaine found himself acknowledging Bernaf's agility. Though he would never say it aloud, he admired the knight's swift reactions, silently admitting to himself that this opponent was impressively fast. His eyes gleamed with a mix of respect and the thrill of competition. The realization didn't deter him, but instead fueled his determination to dominate. Bernaf, meanwhile, felt the shift in Ghislaine's demeanor. Sensing the hint of admiration in his opponent's eyes, he gritted his teeth. He refused to allow himself to be overtaken by this adversary, cursing silently as he narrowed his eyes. Steeling himself, he prepared to unleash a more forceful attack. The duel resumed with unrelenting ferocity. Both fighters moved with blinding speed, each strike sharper and more decisive than the last. Neither gave the other a moment's respite. Yet as the minutes passed, it became increasingly clear that Ghislaine's superior skill and agility were gradually tipping the scales in his favor. The battle between Ghislaine and Bernaf raged on, each swing of their swords sharp enough to seemingly slice through the air itself. Ghislaine acknowledged Bernaf's formidable strength but refused to let his opponent gain the upper hand. With every calculated attack, his confidence grew, determined not to yield easily. Elena observed from a distance, her disbelief evident. She couldn't comprehend what she was witnessing. The man once ridiculed as a coward was now holding his ground against Bernaf, a knight of exceptional skill. Her shock was visible, her thoughts racing as she struggled to reconcile the reality before her. However, her surprise quickly gave way to something darker. A fiery intensity flashed across her crimson eyes, the anger within her swelling like an unrelenting storm. Doubt and rage churned inside her, threatening to explode as she clenched her fists, unwilling to accept the unfolding scenario. Ghislaine and Bernaf showed no signs of hesitation as they clashed once again. Their swords collided in a fierce exchange, the sharp sound of metal ringing through the stillness of the room. Ghislaine understood the gravity of the situation. This was a fight to the death. One misstep could bring everything to an abrupt and catastrophic end. The duel grew more intense, each strike infused with extraordinary power and precision. Ghislaine felt the resistance of Bernaf's blade meeting his own, but he remained resolute. His focus was unwavering, his determined gaze illuminated by the tension of the moment. As their swords collided with full force, sparks flew, lighting up the dim room momentarily with a brilliant flash. The resounding clash echoed like thunder, reverberating through the space. Ghislaine pressed forward with a powerful strike, forcing Bernaf to retreat under the sheer weight of his assault. For the first time, Bernaf began to falter, struggling to maintain control against Ghislaine's relentless attacks. Yet, just as it seemed Ghislaine had gained the upper hand, Bernaf countered with a sudden, unexpected strike. His blade darted toward Ghislaine with precision and speed, compelling him to dodge at the last possible moment. The peril of the fight became even more pronounced, as the smallest mistake could now lead to a devastating conclusion. Both warriors fought on, knowing that their lives hung by the thinnest of threads. Ghislaine continued his relentless battle, each swing of his sword executed with undeniable strength. Bernaf, however, was no easy foe. Their swords collided with ferocity, sending sharp sparks into the air, each clash pushing them to their limits. Ghislaine felt the resistance of Bernaf's blade, forcing him to remain focused and precise in every move. As Bernaf launched a powerful strike that nearly toppled Ghislaine, he recognized the familiar technique. A smirk of confidence crossed his face as he silently noted how predictable Bernaf's style had become. Having learned to counter his opponent's patterns, Ghislaine was prepared for the next move. Suddenly, Bernaf unleashed a devastating swing, sending Ghislaine rolling across the ground. Dizzy and momentarily stunned, Ghislaine refused to yield. Determination burned in his eyes, his resolve unwavering despite the pain coursing through his body. When Ghislaine retaliated with a strong attack, Bernaf countered with remarkable speed, striking him down again. The force of the blow left Ghislaine sprawled on the floor, his body aching from the relentless onslaught. Bernaf remained relentless, refusing to give him even a moment to recover. Bernaf's next attack sent Ghislaine stumbling again, but he quickly regained his balance, leaping out of harm's way. Even as his body strained under the pressure, Ghislaine refused to back down. He watched Bernaf closely, his thoughts racing as he began to suspect that his opponent was drawing on some form of magical energy to sustain such strength and endurance. Even Bernaf silently acknowledged the unexpected skill of his adversary. His thoughts reflected a grudging respect for Ghislaine's unconventional swordplay. The young lord's techniques bore no resemblance to formal training but instead hinted at a wealth of experience gained through countless battles. Bernaf concluded that Ghislaine must have honed his style against savage opponents, adapting instinctively to survive. Determined not to let Ghislaine regain any momentum, Bernaf intensified his offensive. Each strike was sharper, more deliberate, forcing Ghislaine to retreat further. Confident in his ability to dominate, Bernaf dismissed Ghislaine's chaotic fighting style as ineffective against his precision and control. He resolved that the fight would end here, his determination reflected in every strike. Bernaf's attacks grew relentless, his unwavering intent to conclude the battle leaving no doubt about his ultimate goal. Ghislaine, with his breath uneven and labored, refused to yield despite the mounting fatigue. A bitter smile crossed his face as he acknowledged the difficulty of the fight. The challenge was as great as he had anticipated. He could feel the overwhelming strength of Bernaf and quickly understood that his opponent was not only physically dominant but also remarkably precise and calculated in every move. Analyzing the situation, Ghislaine noted how Bernaf's strikes targeted his head with impeccable accuracy, utilizing a masterful sense of distance and timing. Dodging such blows was nearly impossible. Furthermore, at close range, the size disparity between them made it clear that technique alone would not be enough to secure victory. Realizing his miscalculation, Ghislaine admitted to himself that facing Bernaf might have been a mistake from the beginning. The thought crossed his mind that he should have avoided testing himself against such a formidable adversary. Yet, despite this realization, the determination in his eyes remained steadfast. He knew the battle was far from over. Gathering himself, Ghislaine steadied his stance, his breathing still quick but focused. He recognized the urgency of the situation, understanding that time was not on his side. With renewed resolve, he channeled all his remaining strength into his grip, readying himself for another confrontation with Bernaf. As he prepared for the next attack, he felt a surge of power course through his body, filling him with unexpected energy. Ghislaine struck with a fierce, calculated swing, sending his blade toward Bernaf with newfound intensity. This time, the attack carried a weight and precision that would be far harder to counter. Bernaf turned just in time to notice the shift in Ghislaine's strength, his sharp eyes detecting something unusual. It dawned on Bernaf that this was no ordinary strike. The word mana crossed his thoughts as he observed the strange energy radiating from Ghislaine. Confusion flickered across Bernaf's face as he struggled to understand how his opponent was wielding such power with such mastery. For the first time, he realized the true depth of the challenge he faced. In a flash, Ghislaine closed the distance between them, his blade slicing through the air with an unstoppable force. Bernaf, reacting swiftly, drew upon all his strength and skill to evade the attack. Despite his efforts, the strike landed, leaving him with a deep and painful wound. The power of the blow left Bernaf staggered, blood streaming down his face. His mind reeled with shock and frustration as he tried to process what had happened. He couldn't understand how Ghislaine had executed such a devastating attack, disbelief and anger flickering across his expression. From the sidelines, Elena watched the scene unfold with growing alarm. Her concern for Bernaf spilled over as she rushed toward him, her voice ringing out in desperation. She couldn't stand idle while one of her strongest allies was wounded so severely. Ghislaine refused to let Bernaf recover. With relentless precision, he lifted his sword and struck again, aiming to capitalize on his advantage. The force behind the attack sent Bernaf to the ground, eliciting a sharp cry of pain that echoed throughout the room. He crumpled under the weight of the blow, his body trembling from the relentless assault. Though his wounds were severe, Ghislaine showed no mercy. He pressed forward with another powerful swing, determined to end the fight. Bernaf, summoning his dwindling strength, managed to dodge just in time. The blade missed him by a hair's breadth, leaving only a streak of light in its wake. Ghislaine noticed the subtle shift in Bernaf's movements, realizing his opponent was adapting his strategy. Yet he remained composed, undeterred by the change. The intensity in his gaze betrayed his steadfast resolve to see the battle through. From behind, an urgent voice called out, breaking through the chaos. The warning was clear, it was time to retreat. Bernaf turned his head slightly at the sound, his eyes reflecting a growing sense of unease as he assessed the escalating danger. Protecting others was becoming increasingly difficult, and the weight of the responsibility bore down on him. Recognizing that the situation demanded everything he had, Bernaf steeled himself. He resolved to fight with all his remaining strength, his determination now unshakable. With renewed focus, he prepared for the next clash, his mind and body ready to give their all in what could very well be his final stand. The battle had entered a critical stage, with both warriors pouring every ounce of their strength into the confrontation. Each movement, each strike, carried the full weight of their determination to emerge victorious. Elena observed the fight intently, a satisfied smile spreading across her lips as she watched Ghislaine fight with everything he had. She felt a spark of excitement ignite within her, pleased by his display of unwavering effort. To herself, she noted with quiet approval that this was precisely what she had hoped to see. Ghislaine, despite facing such a formidable opponent, couldn't hide the exhilaration building inside him. The thrill of the fight brought a glint to his eyes and a grin to his face. It had been a long time since he had encountered such an intriguing adversary, and the realization fueled his energy. His expression revealed no sign of fatigue or worry, only a fierce and eager challenge that reflected his unyielding spirit. The vast room exuded a heavy atmosphere, illuminated only by the flickering light of torches along the walls. A young woman rushed through the hallway, her footsteps echoing sharply in the stillness. Her tense expression betrayed her frustration as she clutched a cat tightly to her chest. Anger boiled within her as thoughts of Ghislaine consumed her mind. She could not fathom how he had managed to disgrace her so thoroughly, her face twisted with hatred as she silently cursed his name. The mystery of how he had learned about the Merchant Guild's secrets gnawed at her relentlessly. She questioned who could have leaked the information and how Ghislaine knew so much. Rumors about Ghislaine flashed through her mind, stories of him slaying an orc, protecting his sister from an assassin, and defeating the heir of the Logis family. She had dismissed these tales as exaggerated nonsense, attributing his successes to luck or embellishment. Now, however, as the reality of his abilities became undeniable, bitterness filled her thoughts. The truth was far more humiliating than she had imagined. The oppressive atmosphere of the castle heightened her unease. She couldn't make sense of the chaos unfolding outside. Her crimson eyes burned with fury as she tried to comprehend the situation. She silently demanded to know where the guards she had stationed outside had gone, frustration and confusion mingling in her racing thoughts. Each step she took echoed ominously in the dim corridor. Stopping abruptly, her gaze fixed on a distant point, her breath caught as she took in the grisly sight before her. Soldiers lay sprawled across the floor, their faces pale and lifeless. There was no sign they had even resisted the assault. Her stomach churned at the overwhelming stillness of the scene. From the shadows, a blurred figure began to emerge. The silhouette of a masked individual stepped forward, their movements eerily calm and precise as they navigated the bodies scattered across the floor. The air seemed to grow colder with every step the figure took, the tension in the corridor thickening unbearably. The absence of any visible signs of battle only added to the sinister nature of what had occurred. Her anger faltered as dread took hold, creeping into her expression. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, her earlier defiance fading into uncertainty and fear. A second figure then appeared from the dim light, a woman cloaked in black, her face adorned with a cryptic smile. The woman spoke with an unsettling familiarity, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that cut through the stillness. She addressed the young woman without hesitation, remarking that it had been a long time since their last meeting. The woman in the room froze in astonishment. The mention of Perdium's servant had caught her completely off guard, leaving her visibly confused. Her bewilderment deepened as she attempted to piece together the situation, only for her thoughts to be interrupted. The cloaked girl raised a single finger to her lips and gestured for silence, her smile carrying an air of unsettling intent. Without hesitation, her hand reached behind the startled woman, pressing lightly against her neck. The directive was clear silence. Caught off guard, the woman tried to resist, but her shock and fear rendered her momentarily incapable of reacting. It wasn't long before she realized something was amiss. A sharp sensation, like the graze of a blade, passed close by. Her terror intensified as she grasped the severity of her predicament, the words dying in her throat before they could form. Frustration twisted the face of the cloaked girl as she looked down at the spiders crawling over her lips. With a gesture of distaste, she swiped them away, her irritation evident. Meanwhile, a woman with silver hair and a black cloak stepped forward, her tone laced with mockery as she addressed the scene. The newcomer pointedly remarked on the girl's association with the spiders. She recalled an event at the girl's engagement ceremony where whispers about Count Rayfold and his master had been overheard. Her sharp tone conveyed both sarcasm and faint amusement. She continued, adding that the girl had bred the spiders to defy those who had mocked her for them, particularly her siblings. Yet her motives remained unclear. Was it to overcome her fear or to assert dominance? The silver-haired woman delivered her final observation with biting candor, pointing out that such an approach didn't suit the girl, regardless of her intent. With deliberate steps, the woman's boots struck the ground sharply, her voice growing more commanding. She demanded compliance, leaving no room for argument, and asked if the girl was ready to cooperate without further defiance. Back at the battle, Ghislaine found himself amidst a rising tension, the air growing heavier with every passing moment. He scanned his surroundings, keenly aware of the ominous atmosphere. The air is suffocating, he mused to himself, his senses sharp and on edge. Standing before him was a masked man, his presence radiating an immense amount of mana that caught Ghislaine off guard. The sheer intensity of the power was unlike anything he had felt before. He couldn't help but feel a moment of awe. Such an overwhelming amount of mana. The thought echoed in his mind, leaving him momentarily dazed. Despite the mounting pressure, both combatants held their ground, their gazes locked in unwavering confrontation. Ghislaine's expression betrayed nothing but confidence, his demeanor calm and unflinching. His eyes bore into the masked man with a hint of amusement, as though the entire ordeal were merely a game. A faint smile played across his lips, as if taunting his opponent, daring him to make the next move. Bernaf sneered at Ghislaine, his expression laced with scorn. He remarked mockingly that only humble mercenaries spoke in such a manner and questioned how someone like Ghislaine could dare to call himself a noble, let alone one comparable to his mistress. Ghislaine responded with a cold, unwavering tone, declaring himself undeniably a noble. His sharp gaze pierced through Bernaf as he continued, stating that someone as lowly as a mere bodyguard could never understand the world of true nobility. As the battle intensified, Ghislaine unleashed a powerful slash, the force of his attack aimed directly at his opponent. The tension in the air thickened as both combatants prepared for the next clash. Bernaf's anger boiled over as he lashed out verbally, accusing Ghislaine of sullying the honor of nobility. His contempt was unmistakable, each word dripping with disdain as he retaliated both in words and strikes. Despite Bernaf's growing aggression and superior strength, Ghislaine remained composed. He refused to be intimidated, even as he began to recognize the formidable skill of his adversary. With resolve etched into his expression, Ghislaine prepared himself for the next exchange, fully aware of the challenge before him. The battle grew fiercer as both warriors launched relentless attacks. Ghislaine fought without hesitation, yet the consistent, calculated strikes of his opponent forced him to pause and reevaluate his approach. It became clear to him that Bernaf was far more resilient and skilled than he had initially anticipated. Through gritted teeth, Ghislaine admitted to himself the strength behind his opponent's blows. He began to realize that this was no ordinary foe, someone who demanded his absolute best. With the duel nearing its climax, Ghislaine prepared to unleash his final technique, despite the exhaustion creeping into his limbs. As Ghislaine moved to strike, Bernaf reacted with astonishing speed, breaking through his defense and disrupting his attack. The tables had turned, and the battle's conclusion was now within Bernaf's grasp. With an air of finality, Bernaf declared the fight over. Addressing his adversary directly, he made it clear that the duel had reached its end, leaving no doubt as to the victor. He thrust his sword toward Ghislaine with ferocious force, but Ghislaine remained steadfast. Countering with equal intensity, his blade slashed through the air with lightning speed, carving powerful arcs. The clash of steel filled the room, and blood sprayed from the fierce exchange. Pain flared from the wound on Ghislaine's shoulder, but he refused to let it slow him down. His gaze stayed locked on his opponent, unyielding and fearless. Though his adversary's strength was immense, Ghislaine's resolve only hardened, his spirit remaining unbroken. As the battle continued, Ghislaine realized his opponent had executed what seemed to be his final move. Though blood flowed freely from his wound, he charged forward without hesitation, using the last of his strength to mount another assault. Bernaf, feeling the growing pressure, admitted to himself that even a moment of carelessness could cost him dearly. The thought lingered as he steeled himself against Ghislaine's relentless determination. The tension in the room thickened as sparks burst from each clash of their blades. Light flickered in the darkness, highlighting the grueling intensity of the fight. Despite the agony coursing through his body, Ghislaine pushed through, his resolve undiminished. Each step forward was driven by sheer willpower, propelling him to keep fighting. Though the relentless attacks from his opponent pressed him further, Ghislaine refused to back down. He funneled all his strength into his counterattacks, ignoring the burning pain from his injuries. Every blow from Bernaf seemed more powerful than the last, intensifying the atmosphere until it felt as though the air itself might shatter. With a decisive move, Ghislaine swung his sword with an unexpected surge of power. The resounding clash of steel reverberated through the room as his blade collided with Bernaf's weapon, sending shockwaves across the space. Bernaf's cold, calculating gaze bore into Ghislaine. He silently noted the difference between them. He was not one to wield a blade lightly, and that distinction separated him from those who fought without true purpose. His silent assessment carried the weight of a warrior seasoned by countless battles. Ghislaine faced his opponent with unwavering focus, channeling his energy into every strike. Despite the intensity of the fight, a trace of amusement flickered through his mind. He observed the battlefield and noted how his opponent's speed, reach, and relentless blows had completely dominated the flow of the battle. It was clear to him that any attempt to counter with close-range techniques, like grappling, was being effortlessly neutralized. As their swords clashed, his opponent created the illusion that their blades were entangled, a clever ploy to mislead him into thinking they couldn't separate. Ghislaine, however, saw through the trick. Yet he acknowledged his growing disadvantage, knowing his current mana reserves wouldn't allow him to withstand many more assaults. But then, a spark of confidence reignited within him. He recognized that his unique mana control technique, the Third Heart, would change everything. With a silent resolution, he prepared to unleash its power. This fight, he decided, would end now. After gathering himself, Ghislaine launched a fierce counterattack. His blade moved with precision and strength, striking repeatedly and forcing his opponent to retreat. Though the clash pushed him back briefly, Ghislaine's resilience never wavered, and his determination remained unshaken. Bernaf, observing Ghislaine's sudden surge of power, was struck by disbelief. He couldn't fathom how the young master was able to generate such an explosive output of mana. The difference in their strength was becoming glaringly obvious. Despite his best efforts, Bernaf found himself losing ground as Ghislaine's relentless strikes left no room for recovery. With one decisive motion, Ghislaine's blade stopped, resting lightly against Bernaf's forehead. The room fell silent, charged with the weight of the battle's outcome. Suddenly, a sharp voice shattered the tension. The command to stop rang out with authority, accompanied by a flash of light from Ghislaine's blade as it cut through the air one last time. Ghislaine paused, his eyes fixed on Bernaf, who knelt before him, gasping for breath. Cold determination shone in his gaze as he observed his opponent's trembling form. The young lady stepped forward, her voice filled with fury as she broke the silence. She reprimanded Ghislaine for going too far, demanding the fight's end. Offering 10,000 gold, she ordered Bernaf to take the money and leave her sight. Ghislaine's lips curled into a smug smirk as he absorbed her words. Her interference was predictable, but it only amused him further. He reflected on her sudden willingness to negotiate and considered how things might have gone differently if she'd simply agreed to his terms earlier. From the sidelines, a voice remarked sarcastically on the brutality of the encounter, likening it to a squabble between husband and wife. Ghislaine dismissed the comment casually, explaining that it was merely a minor disagreement. However, he quickly turned his attention back to Amelia, delivering an update with characteristic arrogance. He announced that the price had risen to 20,000 gold. Amelia's glare deepened as she digested his words. Her irritation with Ghislaine's lack of respect was palpable, yet there was an undeniable weight to his presence that she couldn't ignore. No matter how infuriating he could be, his sheer audacity demanded her attention, leaving her both frustrated and begrudgingly captivated. After the intense battle, the aftermath was evident in the bodies of guards scattered across the floor. The sharp crash of a shattered flower pot echoed through the heavy air, reflecting the anger that lingered in the room. One of the guards, his expression tense, broke the silence, admitting his failure. He remarked that Ghislaine was nothing like the rumors suggested. The guard confessed that he had underestimated the situation, highlighting how Ghislaine had wielded such immense mana during the fight that he could overwhelm even a high-ranking knight. From behind, a young woman observed the scene, letting out a heavy sigh as she took in the devastation. Concern clouded her eyes as she murmured to herself about how much Ghislaine had changed. A man standing beside her spoke up without hesitation, suggesting whether the matter should be reported to Duke Delphine. His calm, decisive tone reflected his readiness to act. However, the woman quickly shook her head, her response laden with tension. She cautioned him to watch his words carefully, warning him of the dangers tied to Duke Delphine's involvement. If the Duke learned of the events that had transpired, it would spell disaster for them all. The woman continued, her tone growing sharper. She revealed the true reason behind her secret collaboration with Duke Delphine, an alliance forged to support his rebellion in exchange for his help in overthrowing Perdium. The weight of her predicament was evident as she admitted that if their dealings were exposed, she would likely be killed by her own siblings. Her voice carried a desperate resolve as she concluded that, by any means necessary, Ghislaine had to be eliminated. The guard nodded coldly, responding with a simple acknowledgement of her command. He then inquired about Ghislaine's condition, providing his observations. He noted that Ghislaine bore multiple injuries, the most significant being a deep wound on his shoulder. After expending such a burst of mana, the guard explained, Ghislaine's physical state would remain unstable for some time. He warned that employing the local knights for the task would risk leaving traces, which was something they couldn't afford. The woman nodded in understanding. Her response was sharp and calculated, indicating that this exact scenario was why she had been cultivating a different kind of force. The guard hesitated, his voice faltering as he questioned her intent. Could it be? He began, his unease evident. She confirmed his suspicions, her expression unwavering. She described the merciless, nameless individuals she intended to employ, seasoned veterans of the battlefield, devoid of humanity or reputation. These were specialists, assassins from an underground organization dealing in death. The woman affirmed her plan, explaining with confidence that this group, known as beast traders, was her chosen weapon. She instructed that only those among them with exceptional mana control be selected, underscoring the deadly precision she required for the task ahead. The man listened intently, his eyes reflecting a clear understanding of the plan. With a firm nod, he assured the young woman that he fully grasped her instructions and would ensure everything was executed as planned. The narrow canyon path, the only route connecting Rayfold's territory to Peridium, presented the perfect setting for their strategy. Its remote location and confined terrain made it an ideal place to deal with matters discreetly. Bernaf, brimming with resolve, declared his readiness to prepare for the task at hand. Standing nearby, the young woman's crimson eyes burned with hatred as she vowed silently that Ghislaine would pay dearly for the humiliation he had inflicted upon her. Inside the carriage, Ghislaine sat quietly, his thoughts racing as he considered the situation. He suspected Amelia's involvement in the unfolding events but chose not to voice his suspicions. His musings were interrupted when someone asked if he was all right. Without any visible surprise, he calmly adjusted his sleeve, revealing bandages beneath, and reassured them that there was no need for concern. He dismissed his injuries as insignificant. Internally, he reflected on his condition. While the wound wasn't deep, it was a strain on his already overexerted body. He acknowledged that the 20,000 gold from Amelia was a substantial sum, one that could expedite the reconstruction of his territory by several years. Despite this, the thought of eliminating her crossed his mind. Yet he dismissed the idea, knowing it would inevitably lead to a territorial conflict that could destabilize his land. Ghislaine turned his thoughts to the precarious state of Peridium, recognizing its weakening defenses against the barbarians. He understood that this moment presented the perfect opportunity to counter their aggression. Moreover, the secrets he had uncovered about the Demon Guild granted him leverage over Amelia, ensuring she would act with caution. Resolving to exploit her position to its fullest, he steeled himself for what lay ahead. A woman seated nearby broke the silence, observing how events had unfolded precisely as Doran had predicted. Ghislaine responded with a detached acknowledgement, his gaze remaining fixed ahead. She elaborated on the plan, explaining that the guards were to be subdued during any commotion, forcing Amelia to emerge where she could be taken hostage. Ghislaine, maintaining his calm demeanor, confirmed her statement while noting that the task had been entrusted to Lord Fergus. Though his tone was steady, his exhaustion was evident. Seated in the carriage, the strain of the day began to show. A sudden cough shook him, and his hand trembled as he observed the blood staining his palm. He recognized the toll of activating the third core, the residual effects less severe this time but still troubling. He thought to himself about the urgency of finding a way to replenish his mana quickly. Without a solution, he feared he wouldn't be prepared for the adversaries waiting in the future. His gaze shifted to Valinda, suspicion glimmering in his weary eyes. After a moment of silence, he softly addressed her, his tone probing as if searching for answers. There was an air of doubt as he spoke her name, seeking clarity in the unspoken tension between them. Valinda remained composed as she turned her gaze to Ghislaine. Her expression was calm, though a hint of concern flickered in her eyes. She observed the chaotic flow of mana within him, noting its instability with a cold yet thoughtful tone. The strands of magical energy glowing around her hands radiated brightly as she worked to heal his wounds. Ghislaine bit his lip, feeling the powerful surge of mana coursing through his body. He recognized it as the chaotic mana path he had been working tirelessly to clear. Despite the pain it caused, he could sense progress. His mana was beginning to flow more smoothly. The discomfort paled in comparison to the satisfaction of knowing he had taken a significant step forward. As his hand brushed over his still bleeding wound, Ghislaine reassured himself internally that this was the correct path. Though the injury sapped his strength, he knew recovery was crucial. He murmured Valinda's name softly, the sound barely audible. Her presence had always been enigmatic to him, ever since his mother introduced her to their household. He had suspected from the start that she wasn't an ordinary servant. Now, watching her mastery of magic as she healed him, he felt a deepening sense of connection, one he hadn't fully acknowledged before. His sharp eyes lingered on her as she sat in the dim light, her crimson eyes glowing like embers. The radiance of her magic illuminated her figure, casting long shadows around the carriage. There was something about her presence that unsettled him, a power and purpose that seemed to exceed the role of a simple housekeeper. He couldn't shake the question that gnawed at his mind: why would someone so powerful choose such a modest position?
Ghislaine's thoughts drifted to his broader goals. He saw the value of surrounding himself with powerful allies, knowing they would strengthen his domain. For now, he reflected, everything he had faced so far felt like just the beginning. The changes within him were undeniable, and he resolved to build on them.
Breaking the silence, Valinda spoke, her tone steady but questioning. She expressed her trust in him, declaring that she would support him unconditionally. But she couldn't suppress her curiosity. She wanted to know why he had taken the gold from Amelia. Ghislaine responded calmly, his tone measured yet sharp. He explained that he had needed the funds and Amelia was the only person in the region wealthy enough to provide them. Her frustration became evident as her tone sharpened. She couldn't believe he had taken such a significant risk merely for money. She warned him of the potential consequences, pointing out that if Count Raypold learned of this, the fallout could be severe. Unperturbed, Ghislaine offered her a slight, confident smile. He reassured her that Amelia wouldn't reveal anything to Raypold, his tone light but certain. The atmosphere in the carriage grew heavier, the tension thick with unspoken thoughts. Ghislaine's sharp gaze settled on Valinda, his eyes probing for certainty. Without looking away, he asked her with quiet intensity if she trusted him, the question carrying more weight than his words alone. The attendant smiled faintly, her expression tinged with both amusement and concern. She acknowledged Ghislaine's determination but couldn't resist adding a remark. She noted that someone who had gone to such lengths to save him deserved to know what he planned to do with the money. Without hesitation, Ghislaine responded with a firm declaration. He stated his intention to develop the Forest of Beasts, a task that surprised the group. Lord Fergus immediately objected, his voice rising in protest as he reminded Ghislaine of the numerous attempts made to explore the forest since the time of his great-grandfather. The implications of such an endeavor seemed daunting. However, Ghislaine interrupted with a cold and decisive demeanor, steering the conversation in another direction. He questioned Lord Fergus about the task he had assigned before their arrival in the city. Fergus admitted that the individual Ghislaine sought had been located, but he voiced concerns about the person's current condition, asking if Ghislaine was truly certain. Ghislaine dismissed the concerns with unwavering resolve, stating that as long as the person was alive, that was enough. He expressed his intention to go there personally. Lord Fergus, deeply worried, tried to dissuade him, emphasizing that Ghislaine's current physical state made such a journey reckless. Yet, Ghislaine remained steadfast, shifting his attention to the attendant to address a pressing concern. He questioned whether Amelia's faction would let them leave unscathed after what had transpired. The attendant's worry was evident as she hesitated to respond, reflecting on Amelia's nature. Ghislaine's thoughts filled the silence. He was certain Amelia would seek revenge to eliminate any loose ends, and he knew the danger wasn't over. Breaking the tension, the attendant spoke with unexpected confidence, offering her own abilities as reassurance. She declared her skill in combat and reminded Ghislaine of Lord Fergus's capabilities as a knight. She insisted that if necessary she would handle any threats quickly. Ghislaine, amused by her conviction, smiled lightly and reassured her. While her confidence was appreciated, he reminded her that their roles differed and that her strength wasn't meant for such tasks. His focus shifted as he announced his intention to meet the person they had found, making it clear that this was a critical step forward. When they arrived at their destination, Ghislaine knocked on the door with firm resolve. The attendant muttered under her breath about the state of the family, remarking on its apparent decline. Lord Fergus confirmed the location with a curt nod, affirming that this was indeed the place. The door creaked open to reveal an elderly man with long white hair and a beard. His weathered voice carried a question of identity as he addressed the group. The sight of him left everyone momentarily stunned, his frail appearance starkly contrasting with their expectations. The attendant, breaking the silence, leaned toward Ghislaine with a mischievous whisper. She questioned whether this man was truly the trailblazer Ghislaine had described, noting his feeble demeanor. Her skepticism was evident as she joked that he looked more like someone on the verge of death. Ghislaine, however, remained resolute. With unwavering confidence, he declared that they had indeed found the right person, silencing further doubts and leaving no room for argument. The elderly man, his long white hair and beard framing a face etched with confusion, seemed taken aback. His initial reaction was sharp as he yelled, dismissing Ghislaine with clear annoyance. He accused the young noble of wasting his time and demanded that he leave immediately. Ghislaine, unfazed by the outburst, responded with a cold demeanor, his tone steady and authoritative. He introduced himself as the captain of the Regressed Mercenary Corps, his words cutting through the tension in the air. At this, the old man's single eye lit up with a glimmer of recognition and intrigue. Sensing he now had the man's attention, Ghislaine continued, his tone shifting slightly to one of respect. He expressed his genuine desire to meet him, his words laden with purpose and intent. The white-haired man widened his eyes in shock, his expression filled with astonishment as he reacted to the name of the Regressed Mercenary Guild. The mention of the guild brought a mixture of surprise and doubt to his face. The Regressed Mercenary Guild was once a legendary group of warriors renowned across the lands. Only those who mastered nearly all forms of weaponry could join their ranks. Though the guild had disbanded long ago, their fame still echoed throughout the continents. Their glorious achievements were so well known that even knights from the farthest lands had heard their name at least once in their lives. Memories of the past surged in his mind. He vividly recalled the image of battle-hardened warriors, armor torn and tattered but eyes unwavering with determination. As the realization struck, he froze. The person standing before him, exuding strength and resolve, was none other than the guild leader of that legendary army. The atmosphere grew unnervingly silent as Ghislaine spoke with unwavering confidence, his presence commanding the space around him. The old man's weary eyes lit up briefly at the mention of the name Gillian. His beard-covered face stiffened, his sharp gaze reflecting a mix of wariness and surprise. Ghislaine stepped forward with a faint smile on his lips. Though his expression seemed calm, his eyes burned with determination. He extended his hand with firm resolve, signaling his intention to meet the man before him. The tension in the room felt as though time itself had frozen. Suddenly, a tremendous force erupted, shattering the silence. A piercing sound tore through the still air as an attack hurtled forward with terrifying speed, ripping apart the space around it. A pale blue glow enveloped the strike, radiating an unmistakable aura of cold, deadly intent. The attack raced toward Ghislaine like a bolt of lightning slicing through the air. He tilted his body slightly, dodging the blow by mere inches. His sharp gaze remained fixed ahead, his expression calm yet resolute. Despite his composed demeanor, the killing intent radiating from him was unmistakable. From behind, Gillian narrowed his eyes, carefully observing the situation. The two men standing beside him were stunned by Ghislaine's speed and composure. One of them gasped in disbelief, unable to take his eyes off the young man. A deep voice emerged from the shadows carrying a mix of understanding and challenge. It questioned with a slow, deliberate tone, as if testing the waters. The speaker seemed to imply, "So you know me?" Tension soared to its peak as Gillian's towering figure emerged from the dense Manhwa fog. His back was straight, his hands relaxed at his sides, yet he exuded an overwhelming aura of power. Despite the suffocating atmosphere, Ghislaine and his companions stood firm. They drew their swords in unison, the glint of steel reflecting their unwavering determination. The inevitability of the impending confrontation hung thick in the air. Gillian fixed his piercing gaze on Ghislaine, his deep and commanding voice cutting through the tension. He demanded an explanation for their presence, his tone leaving no room for avoidance. Without hesitation, Belinda stepped forward, her hand gripping the hilt of her sword tightly. Her sharp eyes reflected both caution and defiance as she turned toward Ghislaine. With a calm but firm voice, she advised him to step back, warning that Gillian was no longer in his right mind. Yet Gillian remained rooted in place, his heavy breaths resembling those of a wild beast poised to strike. The atmosphere around him thickened, weighed down by an invisible force. Belinda's voice rang out again, this time colder and more resolute, as she declared the phrase "eternal punishment." The words cut into Gillian's consciousness like a blade, striking at his very core. His old eyes widened, and his face betrayed a mix of terror and helplessness. Meanwhile, Ghislaine took another steady step forward. His voice was calm but carried the weight of a proclamation as he revealed that he knew how to cure the terminal illness afflicting Gillian's daughter. Silence fell over the area. Gillian froze, his sharp gaze slowly shifting to one of suspicion, laced with a glimmer of hope. Those around him unconsciously turned their attention to Ghislaine, waiting for the old man's response. Ghislaine tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes locking onto Gillian's. His voice carried an enigmatic edge, as though he were laying down a challenge. He questioned whether this revelation would spark Gillian's interest. For a brief moment, Gillian's weathered face softened, yet his eyes remained clouded with doubt. Memories of his ailing daughter resurfaced vividly in his mind, further unsettling his resolve. The unrelenting fevers, weak and labored breaths, and bouts of violent coughing marked the progression of the illness. Bright red blood seeped from the corners of her mouth. On her pale skin, crimson spots blossomed like withered petals, spreading across her frail body. The excruciating pain twisted her figure, as though she were enduring an inescapable, cruel punishment. The disease was known as eternal punishment, a terrifying curse that left its victims resembling prisoners tormented in despair. The image of a frail child lying on a bed, her emaciated figure and hollow eyes void of life, gripped Gillian's heart with unrelenting force. His breaths quickened as he recalled the helplessness he had endured all this time. This disease was more than just a nightmare, it was a brutal reminder of despair and irrevocable loss. From the small room, agonizing screams echoed. Gillian knelt before his daughter's bloodied body, his large, trembling hands clasping her small, cold ones. His voice cracked with desperation as he called out her name, his grief consuming him. Behind him, Ghislaine observed the heartbreaking scene. Though his expression was calm, his eyes betrayed a flicker of sadness. He stepped forward, his voice steady yet resolute, as if affirming a certainty. He said it was not too late. But time, indifferent and relentless, had moved on. In Ghislaine's memory, he knew how this tragic tale had ended. All of Gillian's desperate efforts had been in vain. When Ghislaine had sought him out for recruitment, Gillian was no longer among the living. The man had surrendered to despair and taken his own life shortly after losing his beloved daughter. Gillian glanced around the dilapidated house. Dust-covered weapons and worn-out belongings were all that remained. His thoughts turned inward. Judging by the state of the house, it was clear Gillian had poured all his wealth into his daughter's treatment. The emptiness of the space was suffocating. All that remained now was a collection of weapons, a bitter reminder of what had been lost. In Gillian's arms, Rachel's frail body trembled. Her weak voice, fractured by labored breaths, broke through the silence. Blood stained her small frame as she pleaded, her eyes full of unbearable pain. She begged for release, saying she couldn't endure the agony any longer and just wanted it all to end. Gillian held her tightly, his large hands trembling as he clung to her fragile form. His voice, filled with anguish, called her name again, a cry of helplessness that resonated through the room. Behind them, Ghislaine drew in a deep breath. His sharp, determined gaze locked onto the heartbreaking scene as he shrugged off his coat. His voice, resolute and unwavering, cut through the suffocating tension. He declared that there was no time left to waste and announced his intention to begin treatment immediately. Just as Ghislaine prepared to act, a hand unexpectedly rested on his shoulder, stopping him in his tracks. He immediately turned his head, his eyes filled with caution. Someone had intervened at this crucial moment. Belinda's hand remained firm on his shoulder, her expression both stern and tinged with worry. Her voice, low yet resolute, carried an air of authority as she urged him to step back. Her sharp gaze locked onto him, as though attempting to awaken his rationality. She questioned his intentions, pointing out the futility of relying solely on strength. She reminded him that this was a disease so terrifying that even the priests, unable to cure it, had declared it a punishment from the gods. How could he possibly hope to deal with such a curse? Ghislaine offered no response. Instead, he silently turned away, removing his coat with a calm yet unshakable determination. His voice, steady but brimming with resolve, broke the tension in the room as he declared his ability to cure the girl. Belinda's eyes widened, stunned by his unwavering conviction. Instinctively, she called out, her voice filled with disbelief. However, Ghislaine had already made his decision. He stood firm, ready to face a seemingly insurmountable challenge. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, his resolute gaze fixed on Rachel, who lay writhing in pain. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smirk curling at the corners of his lips. His sharp, piercing eyes turned toward Belinda. His voice, calm but laced with a quiet challenge, reminded her of her earlier words that she had promised to trust him. For a moment, Belinda was silent, her expression flickering with uncertainty. She could not bring herself to reply. Instead, she stared at the young master before her with a mix of emotions that she could not articulate. Ghislaine did not wait for an answer. Swiftly, he pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket and extended it toward her. His tone remained composed but carried an undeniable sense of authority as he instructed her to take it. Belinda accepted the paper, her astonishment evident. Her wide eyes scanned the contents, a list of herbs. Ghislaine's voice rang out again, filled with firm resolve. He ordered her to purchase all the ingredients listed and return immediately. As she clutched the paper tightly in her hand, Ghislaine knelt beside Rachel, his steady gaze fixed on the frail girl struggling for breath. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with tension, yet hope flickered faintly amidst the despair. Belinda tightened her grip on the paper and nodded, her eyes finally reflecting a spark of trust. Her gaze dropped back to the list, and her voice trembled with disbelief as she realized what it was. The shock in her expression was unmistakable. Ghislaine, however, remained composed. A faint smile played on his lips, his sharp eyes brimming with confidence. As memories of his wandering years flooded his mind, he reflected on the harsh lessons he had learned. For mercenaries like him, who had no home to return to, knowledge had been their sole weapon and the key to survival. It was the only thing that kept them alive on the razor-thin line between life and death. Ghislaine murmured softly to himself, almost as if to reaffirm his determination eternal punishment. The disease was considered incurable at the present time. Yet, Ghislaine knew that in the future, a treatment would emerge. He believed in this and held in his hands a solution to prolong life. Slowly, he opened the leather bag in front of him, his hands carefully extracting the necessary ingredients and tools. The treatment method had once been a groundbreaking discovery in his timeline, largely because of its relatively simple execution. Every step, every detail remained etched in his memory, as if it had only happened yesterday. However, he understood the greatest challenge of this method: the exorbitant cost of the materials. He tightened the bag's mouth with a firm grip, his gaze resolute. Failure was not an option. This time, he would save Rachel. With delicate care, Ghislaine picked up a small branch that emitted a faint purple glow, its magical beauty captivating as though it were imbued with enchantment. His eyes shone with confidence as he whispered to himself, "Fairy's blessing." Placing the branch on the table, he began the preparation process without hesitation. Ghislaine sliced the fairy's blessing into small pieces, combining it with other herbs. His hands moved with precision and agility, each motion deliberate and practiced. Once the mixture was ready, he packed it tightly into a small vial and poured refined alcohol over it. He shook the vial vigorously, ensuring the contents blended perfectly. The pale purple liquid began to glow brightly as the components mixed. Ghislaine set it aside briefly, allowing the mixture to settle before meticulously adding the remaining ingredients. He worked tirelessly, his hands never ceasing to stir the concoction to perfection. From behind, Belinda and the others watched his every move with unblinking eyes. The room was steeped in tension, but a fragile thread of hope lingered in the air as Ghislaine remained entirely focused on his task. Finally, Ghislaine lifted the vial of faintly glowing purple liquid, the light reflecting off Gillian's anxious face. Holding it out toward the man, Ghislaine spoke with unwavering confidence, instructing him to give the mixture to Rachel. Gillian accepted the vial with trembling hands, his gaze a mixture of hope and fear. Kneeling beside Rachel, he carefully removed the cap. The shimmering purple drops trickled down, gently moistening the girl's pale, blood-streaked lips. Cradling Rachel in his arms, Gillian supported her head as he carefully helped her swallow the precious medicine. The light from the vial seemed to carry a glimmer of hope, casting its glow across the dim room. Inwardly, Gillian prayed fervently for a miracle. Rachel lay motionless, her frail body and pallid face still marked with blood. The room fell into an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of Gillian's heavy breaths. Suddenly, Rachel's eyelashes fluttered and her breathing grew steadier. A faint glow radiated from her fragile body, as if signaling the return of life. Her tightly shut eyes slowly opened, a weak glimmer flickering in her gaze. Gillian held his daughter tightly, his eyes filled with amazement and hope. Around them, everyone stood in stunned silence, not daring to utter a word. Ghislaine observed quietly, his calm eyes fixed on the scene. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips, carrying a hint of satisfaction. Amidst the oppressive atmosphere, a small yet undeniable light of hope had begun to emerge. Belinda's gaze was locked on Rachel's body, her voice breaking the silence as she exclaimed in astonishment. She pointed out the fading red spots on Rachel's skin, her tone filled with wonder. The man standing beside her, equally overwhelmed, stared with wide eyes brimming with hope. Gillian bent down to look at Rachel in his arms. His voice, trembling with emotion, escaped in a mix of disbelief and joy. He marveled at the apparent effects of the medicine, as if witnessing a miracle unfold before him. From the back of the room, Ghislaine stepped forward. His calm demeanor remained unshaken as he offered a warm yet confident smile. His voice, steady and reassuring, carried his assessment of the medicine's effectiveness. It had worked exactly as he had anticipated. Gillian turned toward Ghislaine, his wide eyes reflecting both astonishment and newfound admiration for the young man standing before him. The once heavy tension in the room seemed to dissipate, replaced by the faint but growing presence of hope. Still overwhelmed, Gillian's voice quivered as he questioned Ghislaine, struggling to grasp the reality of what had just happened. He remarked on the impossibility of divine powers failing to heal his daughter, yet here was a cure. Ghislaine met Gillian's gaze with unwavering composure, his sharp eyes reflecting quiet confidence. He had clearly prepared for this moment, his words precise and assured. He explained that the powers of priests were not omnipotent. Rather, they served to enhance vitality and stimulate the body's regenerative abilities, aiding patients in enduring their illnesses. Pausing briefly, Ghislaine's piercing gaze seemed to cut through any illusions. He clarified that such efforts were fundamentally different from addressing the root cause of a disease. Hearing this, Gillian's hands trembled, his eyes filled with rising emotion as he turned to Rachel. His voice, faltering with disbelief, reflected the struggle to accept the miraculous truth unfolding before him. The room fell silent again, the only sounds being Gillian's labored breaths and the steady, resolute gaze of Ghislaine. The revelation was clear and heavy with meaning. Miracles were born not of divine power alone, but of knowledge and relentless effort. Overwhelmed, Gillian sank to his knees before Ghislaine, his eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and hope. His voice shook as he pleaded for one final confirmation, asking if his daughter could truly be healed. Ghislaine showed no hesitation, his sharp eyes locking directly onto Gillian. His voice was calm but carried an unwavering certainty as he assured the man that within a few months Rachel would be completely healed. The words ignited a flame in Gillian's heart, a light of hope he had long thought extinguished. His eyes widened in astonishment and overwhelming emotion. A lifetime of helplessness and pain, born from his inability to save his daughter, now seemed to find solace in this sudden and powerful glimmer of hope amidst the darkness of despair. He gazed at the young man standing before him, someone he had never expected to bring such a miracle. His emotions surged, but no words could escape his lips. Only his eyes, filled with gratitude beyond measure, conveyed his feelings. Gillian bowed deeply before Ghislaine, a gesture both solemn and laden with his desperate heart. Though he carried the bearing of a seasoned warrior, in this moment he appeared as nothing more than a vulnerable father, casting aside all pride for the sake of his child. When he finally straightened, his rough voice broke the silence, heavy with sincerity. He acknowledged Ghislaine's long journey to find him and guessed that the young man must need something in return. His gaze, steady yet shadowed by powerlessness, reflected his inner turmoil. Looking down at his trembling, calloused hands, Gillian spoke softly, his words weighted by the passage of time and his waning strength. He admitted that all he had left was his worn and broken body, stripped of its former vigor. His words hung in the air, resonating with the pain and destruction inflicted by years of hardship. A once legendary warrior now stood on the brink of hope but was consumed by doubts about his remaining worth. Suddenly, Gillian erupted in a guttural roar, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and despair. His voice, raw and strained, reverberated through the space as he cried out his willingness to abandon all dignity for his daughter's sake. He declared with fierce desperation that he would become a dog if Ghislaine demanded it, or even a slave if that was what it took to save her. His cries echoed heavy with anguish, as though his life now revolved around this singular purpose. Ghislaine remained standing, his composure unbroken as he faced the kneeling warrior. His voice, firm and resolute, cut through the tension. He calmly rejected the offer of servitude, declaring instead that he needed something far greater. His piercing eyes met Gillian's, sharp and unyielding, as he stated with conviction that he sought Gillian, the captain of the Regressed Mercenary Guild. The words froze Gillian in place. His hands trembled, his breaths came in short gasps, but something deep within him stirred. A faint light began to flicker in his gaze, reigniting a long, dormant fire. Still kneeling, he lowered his head even further, as if feeling the immense responsibility now being placed upon him once more. Ghislaine extended his hand toward Gillian, a silent invitation, an unspoken pact. He did not seek a broken man. What he needed was the renowned leader of a blood-soaked battlefield, a figure capable of inspiring fear and respect in equal measure. As Ghislaine stepped forward, his cold, ice-like gaze remained fixed on the scene. Without a hint of mercy, he tossed a lifeless body onto the floor. The sound of the corpse hitting the ground was stark and final, echoing through the oppressive silence. The figure rolled limply, like an empty shell devoid of life. Around them, the air grew heavier, tension tightening its grip on the room. Belinda and the two men standing behind her stared at Ghislaine, their expressions betraying a mix of astonishment and shock at the scene unfolding before them. The massive man narrowed his eyes, his fists clenching in tension, while Belinda balled her hands tightly, her face filled with confusion and disbelief. All three remained frozen as they observed Ghislaine. He exuded an overwhelming aura, completely different from before. A faint yet menacing killing intent surrounded him like a raging storm on the verge of eruption. One of the men behind whispered in a trembling voice, unable to mask his unease. He muttered how Ghislaine appeared to be an entirely different person. An unsettling sense of dread crept over them, as though the figure before them was no longer the Ghislaine they once knew. A faint pale blue glow flickered around Ghislaine's body. His sharp eyes pierced forward, unwavering, as his white hair swayed lightly in the force radiating from him. His firm stance and deliberate steps were a silent proclamation of absolute strength. Gillian too silently acknowledged the transformation. Ghislaine was no longer the same. The older man moved slowly, his broad shoulders carrying a heavy weight. His gaze fixed ahead, and his gravelly voice broke the stillness of the room as he asked if anyone besides Ghislaine's companions might find their way to this place. Ghislaine remained motionless, his calm eyes steady. With a firm and unhesitating tone, he assured Gillian that only they had come. His piercing gaze carried a resolute determination, free of any doubt or fear. Gillian stopped walking and gripped the shaft of his spear tightly. Lifting the weapon with a deliberate motion, his narrowed eyes glinted with meaning as he posed another question, asking if Ghislaine had enemies who bore grudges against him. A faint smirk curved Ghislaine's lips, his sharp gaze cutting straight through Gillian. His voice, calm yet brimming with confidence, acknowledged that he did. His expression hardened, and a dangerous glint flashed in his eyes as he added that there would undoubtedly be many more in the future. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war, reverberating through the dim room. They affirmed Ghislaine's resolve, a man ready to confront anyone who dared stand in his way. Gillian remained silent, observing him with a contemplative look, the weight of his thoughts etched on his face. As if sealing his decision, Gillian's large hand tightened its grip on the spear. A pale blue light flared around the weapon, enveloping it in an intense, fearsome energy. His voice, low and unyielding, carried the weight of an irreversible decision. He spoke, leaving the rest unspoken but charged with meaning, a challenge, an affirmation, and an acceptance of the path ahead. Without hesitation, Gillian spun around, the spear in his hand sweeping forward with the force of a raging storm. The blade, glowing with radiant energy, tore through the air like a bolt of lightning. The ground beneath him cracked open, debris flying in all directions as the sheer power of his strike erupted. A beam of blue light surged toward its target, accompanied by a piercing, ear-splitting whistle that shredded through the stillness. The immense force sent tremors through the surroundings, shaking everything violently. This attack was no mere sweep of a spear, it carried with it a suffocating, lethal intent. The spear's strike slammed into the ground, detonating with a resounding explosion. Blinding blue light radiated outward, scattering everything in its wake. Thick clouds of dust rose into the air, and the ground fractured into large, jagged pieces. The deafening roar of the blast reverberated through the room, threatening to rip it apart. From afar, Gillian's silhouette stood tall amidst the chaos of his own creation. He gripped the spear firmly, his sharp eyes fixed on the distance, unyielding as he awaited the outcome. His imposing presence resembled that of a war god commanding a brutal battlefield. With a swift pull of the rope attached to his spear, the blade spun, releasing a sharp, green aura. The spear's trajectory shifted seamlessly, now aimed at an approaching enemy. Its devastating force ripped through the air, creating another thunderous explosion. The taut rope yanked a shadowy figure from the distance, the enemy's body flung into the air like a lifeless puppet. Splinters of shattered wood fell around them as Gillian, unrelenting, gave the rope another powerful tug, slamming his foe into the ground. As soon as the dark figure hit the ground, Gillian seized him with unflinching precision. His muscular arm swung with ferocious strength, landing a solid punch on the enemy's face. The blow was swift and decisive, causing the target to emit a pained groan as his body staggered under the impact. Without delay, Gillian grabbed the enemy by the collar, hoisting him effortlessly into the air, as though he were a discarded rag doll. His eyes burned with fury, and his deep, commanding voice cut through the tension, demanding to know who had sent the intruder. The enemy was too stunned to react, his wide eyes brimming with terror as he faced the wrath of the seasoned warrior. The atmosphere in the room grew unbearably oppressive, the only sound the ragged breathing of the man struggling in Gillian's grip. The black-clad intruder quivered, his face contorted in pain as Gillian's iron grip tightened around his neck. His breath came in short, desperate gasps, his voice breaking into fragmented words under the crushing force. He stammered, questioning in disbelief how Gillian could possess such strength. His futile attempts to struggle only highlighted his helplessness. Gillian's expression remained cold and unyielding, his icy gaze fixed on the defeated man. Effortlessly, he lifted the enemy higher, as though the weight of his body was inconsequential. In a deep, commanding tone, Gillian addressed the room, asking how the intruder should be dealt with, his voice carrying both finality and latent menace. Ghislaine stepped forward, his movements deliberate and calm, as if he had already unraveled the truth behind the events. His gaze rested on the black-clad man, his expression composed. He shrugged slightly, his voice soft yet laden with subtle meaning, as if stating a fact rather than asking a question. It was clear he already knew who had sent the intruder. Without waiting for Gillian's response, Ghislaine reached for the hilt of his sword. The blade glinted faintly as he unsheathed it with measured precision. His sharp eyes narrowed, their intensity cutting through the stillness like the edge of his weapon. Though his tone remained steady, a trace of regret slipped into Ghislaine's words as he admitted he had hoped not to draw his sword on a day like this. However, the circumstances left him with no other choice. He stood motionless, the cold steel of his blade reflecting the dim light, prepared for any outcome. The tension in the room was palpable, a taut thread on the verge of snapping. Gillian's gaze met Ghislaine's, his eyes resolute and brimming with a sense of responsibility. He lowered his voice, speaking with a gravelly firmness as he assured Ghislaine that he would handle the matter himself. His words carried the weight of a decision already made, a declaration of his readiness to face the enemy head-on. With that, Gillian tightened his grip around the struggling man's neck. Without hesitation, he lifted the intruder effortlessly, his movements charged with raw fury. With a powerful motion, he hurled the man across the room, his rage manifesting in the sheer force of the throw. The man's scream was abruptly silenced as his body collided violently with the ground, the sound echoing through the room before a heavy silence fell once more. For a moment, the outside sky peeked through a crack, offering a brief glimpse of peace, a stark contrast to the brutality within. As the dust settled, the silence deepened, broken only by the occasional faint rustle. From a distance, Belinda watched quietly, her eyes fixed on Gillian and Ghislaine. She remained silent, her expression unreadable, though her gaze betrayed a mixture of complex emotions. Her thoughts lingered on the scene before her, the air heavy with unspoken trust between the two men. Gillian lowered his head, his right hand clenching tightly, a silent promise etched into his stance. Ghislaine remained motionless, his face void of expression. Yet in his eyes there was a flicker of approval, a subtle acknowledgement of the old warrior's strength. Without words, an understanding passed between them, binding them in that moment. Belinda turned her cold, searching eyes toward Gillian. Her unease and confusion simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but undeniable. Her thoughts swirled with doubt as she questioned Ghislaine's choice to recruit someone so dangerous. The scene she had just witnessed only deepened her apprehension. Ahead, Gillian dropped to one knee, his head bowing deeply before Ghislaine. The once imposing warrior now carried himself with a solemnity that seemed to seal an unbreakable pact. His voice, steady and resolute, broke the silence as he addressed Ghislaine Perdium by name. Raising his head, Gillian's sharp gaze met Ghislaine's, his eyes cold and cutting like a blade, but emanating unwavering loyalty. With a voice as firm as an oath, he declared his allegiance. Each word was deliberate, a solemn vow etched into the fabric of that moment. From that point forward, he swore his very life to Ghislaine. The words hung in the air like a binding pact, casting an almost tangible stillness over the space. Ghislaine allowed a faint smile to grace his lips, his eyes exuding confidence and a profound understanding of the situation. Deep within, a single thought resonated in his mind with this: I have secured the most vital piece for the reconstruction plan ahead. Taking a step forward, his sharp blue eyes seemed to radiate an inner brilliance holding the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. He locked his gaze on Gillian, his voice ringing out clearly, firm and resolute. He expressed his anticipation of working alongside the warrior. The statement lingered in the tense yet hopeful air, marking the beginning of a monumental pact between two resolute individuals, a partnership destined to shape the course of events to come. Outside the decrepit wooden house, the night sky hung heavy, cloaked in an oppressive darkness. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by a chilling piece of news that shattered the stillness. A cold, detached voice rang out, carrying an ominous weight: the reconnaissance unit had been eliminated. Inside the crumbling house, 3 figures stood with tense postures, their gazes scanning the chaotic scene as if searching for answers. One of them, unable to contain his shock, expressed his disbelief. His exclamation echoed faintly in the dimly lit room. The tall man at the forefront stared at the mess before him, his face twisting with a mixture of anger and disdain. he muttered to himself, his irritation unmistakable, cursing the foolishness of the situation. The tension thickened as another voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the murmurs. The single word carried the weight of absolute authority, demanding silence. At once, the room fell silent. The air grew heavy with unease as the man who had spoken stepped forward, his face partially obscured by the shadow of a hood. His tightly pressed lips and the cold intensity of his gaze, hidden beneath the darkness, radiated a suffocating aura of killing intent. The oppressive silence enveloped the room, stifling any thought of rebellion or further words. The hooded figure sank into a crouch, his piercing eyes sweeping across each individual in the room. His voice, low and grating, interrupted the faint whispers that had begun to resurface, commanding them to lower their voices. The room fell into a chilling silence. None dared to oppose him. The name Viego, the infamous leader of the Wildcat Slaver gang, loomed heavily in their minds. Sitting there in the shadowy corner, his presence was like a living nightmare, exuding an air of overwhelming menace. One of the scout soldiers lowered his head, his voice trembling with fear as he stammered an apology. His words were faint and faltering, carrying a palpable sense of terror. Viego narrowed his eyes, his lips curling into a mocking smirk. Rising to his full height, his deliberate footsteps echoed with an air of authority. His words came slowly, each syllable laced with derision, cutting into those before him. He referenced Sir Bernaf's intelligence, dismissively stating that Ghislaine lacked the capability to even detect their reconnaissance unit, let alone eliminate them. Pausing briefly, his sharp gaze settled on one of the trembling soldiers. His voice, dripping with sarcasm, posed a question that sliced through the room like a blade. Was the failure due to the unit's incompetence, or had their intelligence been flawed? The question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy with accusation, as the weight of Viego's presence bore down on everyone in the room. A soldier standing nearby stammered, his voice weak and trembling as he struggled to form words. Fear gripped him, rendering his attempt to speak almost incoherent. His hesitation was short-lived as Viego's dark gaze sharpened with ominous intensity. He showed no interest in listening further. The air in the room seemed to freeze, suffused with a suffocating tension, broken only by the labored, anxious breaths of those present. Under the shadowed hood, Viego pressed his lips into a tense line, his brow furrowing slightly. His voice emerged like the strike of a gavel, announcing a critical piece of information: Gillian had joined forces with Ghislaine. The words cut through the oppressive atmosphere like a dagger, their weight palpable. The soldier nearest to Viego froze, his face draining of color as his wide eyes reflected disbelief. Before he could respond, a rough hand lunged out, seizing him by the throat and slamming him forcefully against the wall. The violent impact echoed sharply through the room. The soldier emitted a strangled cry, his eyes bulging in sheer terror. His panic-stricken face met Viego's, who wore a twisted, grotesque smile. His bloodshot eyes gleamed with a madness that bordered on complete loss of control. Leaning in closer, Viego's voice dripped with manic sarcasm as he demanded confirmation. The pressure around the soldier's neck tightened, Viego's fury radiating like a storm about to erupt. The aura of killing intent enveloped the room, plunging it into an almost tangible darkness. No one dared to move or breathe too loudly under the oppressive weight of his wrath. The subordinate, his face pale with fear, nodded frantically. His voice trembled as he managed to stammer out an affirmation. He claimed to have seen it with his own eyes, insisting there was no mistake. Viego's grip gradually loosened, though the fiery malice in his gaze remained. He paused as if deliberating his next move, his expression unreadable for a fleeting moment. Then a distorted grin spread across his lips and his blood-red eyes flickered with unhinged excitement as he repeated the name aloud: Gillian. His jaw clenched, his voice low and rough, carrying the weight of realization as though savoring the discovery. The name left his lips like the reveal of a long-anticipated twist. Gillian was finally making his move. Viego's breathing quickened, the crimson glow of his eyes deepening in the dim light. He tilted his head slightly, a cold smirk curling his lips as he contemplated the confrontation to come. The thought seemed to ignite something dark within him. With hatred laced with exhilaration, he whispered the name again, his voice almost reverent in its malevolence: Gillian, my captain. The subordinate trembled, too afraid to lift his head, though Viego no longer paid him any attention. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the vivid image of Gillian, a once mighty warrior who had led them through some of the bloodiest battles. Now, that same Gillian stood on the opposing side. Through the dark of night, a horse-drawn carriage sped along at a relentless pace. The wheels ground against the road, and the rapid clatter of hooves shattered the stillness of the countryside. Gillian sat at the reins, his hands gripping them tightly, his stern expression fixed with unwavering focus. The horses galloped hard, their breath forming white clouds in the cold mist that clung to the air. Inside the cramped carriage, Belinda leaned into a corner, her weary eyes narrowing as a wave of discomfort overtook her. Her sigh, tinged with frustration, filled the confined space as she grumbled inwardly about the stifling atmosphere. Her gaze swept over the crowded interior, which was packed with weapons and miscellaneous equipment, amplifying her irritation. The sight of the clutter made her knit her brows as her frustration spilled over. She silently questioned the necessity of carrying so much gear. Did their companion intend to open a weapon shop? Surely a couple of swords would have sufficed. Opposite her, Ghislaine leaned back against the wooden wall of the carriage, his expression calm and indifferent. He remained silent, accustomed to Belinda's complaints and seeing little reason to respond. His unspoken demeanor suggested a tolerance born of habit. Belinda, however, was relentless. Her irritation deepened as she thought about the logistical burden of their journey. The clutter had forced them to purchase an additional carriage, a fact she found infuriating. Her scowl deepened as her thoughts swirled with annoyance. Ghislaine shifted his gaze toward her, his expression remaining composed. After a pause, he finally spoke, his voice steady and soothing. He pointed out that, in any case, the extra carriage had been necessary to ensure Rachel's comfort. His words were practical and meant to diffuse her agitation, but they had the opposite effect. Belinda pressed her lips into a tight line, her frustration simmering as she chose not to reply. Gillian, seated at the front, continued to guide the carriage without a word, seemingly immune to the muffled complaints drifting from behind him. The rhythmic clatter of hooves on the road filled the silence, propelling the group forward through the shadowed night. Trailing behind them, the rear support carriage followed closely. Fergus and Ricardo, two trusted warriors, handled the reins with practiced precision. They maintained the formation carefully, their watchful eyes scanning the surroundings for any potential threat. The carriage wheels rolled steadily over the frost-laden path, their lantern casting a faint glow into the misty darkness. It was a scene both tranquil and oppressive as the weight of their mission pressed heavily on them all. Inside the carriage, Ghislaine turned his sharp, resolute gaze toward Belinda. Lowering his voice, he spoke with deliberate emphasis, explaining that every item Gillian carried served a purpose. His words, firm and unyielding, left no room for argument, urging her to endure the inconvenience. Belinda furrowed her brows at his remark but chose not to respond. She exhaled deeply, crossing her arms as she leaned back against her seat. Her eyes shifted to the rain-soaked window, as if seeking a brief reprieve from the mounting tension inside. The rain poured heavily outside, its relentless cascade engulfing the forest. Under the pitch-black sky, the carriage pressed onward, its wheels grinding against the soaked earth and stones. The rhythmic clatter of hooves mingled with the steady drumming of rain, creating a symphony of urgency and unease. Belinda straightened in her seat, her sharp eyes fixed on Ghislaine with a mixture of scrutiny and suspicion. Breaking the silence, her voice took on a serious yet cautious tone as she brought up the captured overseer. She voiced her belief that the man must have been sent by Lady Amelia. Ghislaine leaned back against the wooden wall, his steely gaze unwavering as he listened. Without hesitation, he gave a slight nod, his calm voice confirming her suspicions with certainty. Belinda's frown deepened, and she pressed her lips into a tight line. The confirmation only solidified her fears, leaving her even more unsettled. The atmosphere inside the carriage grew heavier, the tension palpable as both fell silent, lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the rain continued to fall, its unyielding rhythm merging with the relentless pounding of hooves, a foreboding signal of the turmoil yet to come. For a moment, Belinda sat motionless, her expression grim and tinged with worry. A bead of sweat trailed down her cheek as her mind churned with thoughts of their precarious situation. Her voice dropping to a cautious murmur betrayed her growing unease. She acknowledged the potential complications their predicament could bring. Her hand clenched slightly, her thoughts darting back to the masked overseer. That mask wasn't ordinary. Her sharp eyes gleamed coldly as she dwelled on the detail. It bore the unmistakable symbol of the wildcat traffickers, a notorious smuggling ring with considerable influence in Rayfold. Ghislaine remained leaning against the wall, his gaze steady and unflinching. He murmured the name of the organization under his breath, as if committing it to memory. There was a fleeting hint of contemplation in his expression, but no trace of hesitation. To him, the wildcat traffickers were nothing more than a problem that needed to be addressed. His calm demeanor never wavered, and his cold, determined eyes shifted toward the rain-drenched landscape outside, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Belinda's stare hardened as she faced forward. Her voice, laced with disgust and fury, recounted the crimes of the smuggling ring. They dealt in trafficking, assassination, drugs, and countless other vile acts. She thought of them as filthy creatures, willing to stoop to any depravity for their own gain. The carriage pressed on, its path shrouded in darkness and rain, but inside the atmosphere simmered with a resolve that mirrored the storm outside. Belinda's gaze turned icy, her tone cold and resolute as she elaborated. She explained that many of the wildcat traffickers were seasoned mercenaries, which made the group a formidable underground organization with exceptional combat prowess. Ghislaine's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face as he turned his sharp gaze to Belinda. He questioned how she could know such details, given that she spent most of her time confined within the castle walls. Caught off guard, Belinda hesitated, a faint blush spreading across her cheeks. Her voice faltered as she awkwardly replied, explaining that she had heard about them before she started working there. Her tone grew quieter as she hastily added that the group was tenacious and dangerous, urging caution. Ghislaine's eyes remained fixed ahead, the sharpness in them tempered by a quiet confidence. A faint smile tugged at his lips, his voice calm yet firm, as he silently reassured himself they had Gillian. The carriage sped through the dense night, its wheels grinding against the dry, uneven ground. The rhythmic pounding of hooves shattered the stillness of the deep forest, filling the air with a sense of urgency. From above, two massive bursts of energy ripped through the air, tearing toward the road ahead. The attack descended upon the speeding carriage with terrifying force, enveloping it in imminent danger. Gillian's piercing eyes scanned the darkness before him, his gaze sharp and unyielding. He seemed to sense every threat lurking within the shadows of the stormy night. Suddenly, a surge of immense energy crashed down, tearing apart the eerie stillness. Reacting instantly, Gillian's massive frame spun with startling agility, his powerful arms swinging his weapon to intercept the sudden attack. Standing firm under the torrential rain, Gillian's deep, cold voice cut through the chaos. He assessed the situation with unwavering composure, noting aloud that the ambush was clearly launched from the ground. With a single forceful swing, he deflected the blow of an enemy lunging at him from above. His axe collided violently with the attacker's sword, producing a sharp, deafening clang that echoed through the rain. The two weapons locked against each other, their opposing forces creating a tension so intense it felt as though the very air around them might shatter. Gillian held his ground, his powerful arms steady, unflinching under the pressure of the assault. A sudden slash tore through the rain-soaked air, forcing Gillian to twist his body in a swift, evasive maneuver. With precision born of countless battles, he countered immediately, his axe reversing its arc to strike his opponent with devastating force. The enemy was sent flying, blood spraying into the relentless downpour. Gillian swung his bloodied axe with raw power, the weapon cutting a circular arc through the darkness. The glint of steel illuminated the shadows momentarily as the sheer force of the attack caused the ground to tremble violently. Lifting the axe high with both hands, Gillian brought it down with a crushing blow. The terrifying strike cleaved through another enemy, sending blood splattering across the muddy ground. The foe fell lifeless, unable to react to the overwhelming power. Meanwhile, the remaining attackers scattered, their chaotic footsteps echoing through the storm as they moved to encircle the carriage. The sound of their hurried movements filled the air, but Gillian's sharp gaze tracked each one of them through the darkness. His eyes, cold and calculating, never wavered as he prepared for the next assault. Gillian's eyes darted skyward, narrowing sharply as a massive boulder plummeted toward them with alarming speed. His grip on his weapon tightened instinctively, his stance ready. A single word escaped his lips, curt and filled with warning: a trap. From inside the carriage, Belinda's panicked voice cut through the chaos. She realized the impending danger with a sinking dread the boulder would crush them if they didn't escape. The horses, spurred into action, galloped with desperate speed over the uneven road. Their hooves thundered against the ground as the carriage swayed violently, careening through the dirt and debris. Dust and mud sprayed in every direction as the group raced to outrun the falling stone. Ghislaine sat motionless, his gaze fixed forward, calm yet razor-sharp. His expression betrayed no surprise, and his quiet muttering was as steady as the storm around them. This was exactly as he had anticipated, a calculated ambush. In the distance, silhouettes began to emerge through the thick curtain of rain. The attackers charged from multiple directions, their weapons gleaming ominously in the dim light. Their intent was clear: eliminate anyone who stood in their way. A low, malicious voice rose from the shadows, carrying the weight of dark intent. It uttered a name that resonated with chilling familiarity: Gillian, the former captain of the Regressed mercenary group. The speaker's tone dripped with derision, and his lips curled into a sinister smile, as though victory was already his. Gillian's brow furrowed as he observed the unfolding situation. His sharp eyes flickered with cautious deliberation, and a quiet sigh heavy with weariness slipped past his lips. From the advancing enemy lines, the leader stepped forward, his voice mocking and bitter, pierced through the tension-filled air as he leveled his gaze at Gillian. With a venomous tone, he called out the warrior for his perceived cowardice, accusing him of disbanding an entire mercenary group for the sake of his daughter. Gillian stood tall, his unyielding eyes locked onto the man who sought to provoke him. His voice rang out, firm and detached, dismissing the accusations without hesitation. Whatever his enemy claimed, Gillian would not entertain such baseless provocations. The cloaked leader stepped further into view, his voice rising with anger as he addressed Gillian directly. His words, laced with bitterness, accused the old captain of ruining his life and forcing him into a path he had never wanted. With each word, his tone grew more pointed, as though each syllable was a dagger aimed at Gillian's past. He sneered, suggesting that Gillian, now too old, had forgotten the comrades he had once abandoned. The man's final remark lingered in the air, a challenge steeped in resentment, daring Gillian to confront the ghosts of his past. Rain poured relentlessly, the storm mirroring the tempest of emotions and the clash of wills brewing beneath it. Gillian remained silent, his face contemplative, his eyes betraying a fleeting weariness. He did not respond to the provocation, his brow furrowing slightly as if trying to unearth a memory long buried in the past. The enemy leader sneered, his mocking laughter cutting through the stormy tension. His eyes glinted with a feral intensity as he lowered his voice to deliver a chilling promise. If Gillian insisted on feigning ignorance, he would make sure the old warrior remembered no matter the cost. With a sharp, commanding shout, the leader ordered his men to attack. Their bloodlust surged like a palpable wave, engulfing the area in an oppressive aura of killing intent. Shadows darted forward, weapons gleaming as they closed in with lethal precision, ready to cut down anyone in their path. Ghislaine's gaze flicked toward Gillian. His voice was calm yet suggestive as he inquired whether his assistance was needed. Gillian, however, allowed a faint smirk to curve his lips, his focus never wavering from the advancing enemies. He responded with unwavering confidence, assuring Ghislaine that the attackers were targeting him alone. Ghislaine could rest easy, Gillian would handle this himself. Tightening his grip on the axe in his hand, Gillian's eyes gleamed with a cold, steely resolve. Standing firm amidst the chaos, he murmured to himself, his tone brimming with unshakable certainty. He alone was enough to deal with them. Raising his axe high, its blade radiating an oppressive aura, he prepared to meet the enemy head-on. As the first wave of attackers closed in, Gillian swung his axe with overwhelming force. The spinning blade tore through the air, cutting down the nearest foe in a spray of blood that painted the ground crimson. A second enemy let out a furious cry as he watched his comrade fall. He charged forward, his sword raised high, roaring in rage as he hurled an insult at the old warrior. But Gillian stood unmoved, his sharp eyes fixed on the oncoming threat, undeterred. With a devastating horizontal sweep, Gillian's axe cleaved through the enemy's defenses, its blade slicing effortlessly through his body. One by one, the attackers fell, their blood soaking the battlefield. Though the carnage intensified with every strike, Gillian remained unshaken, a wall of strength that refused to yield. At one point, an enemy lunged with a fierce strike, but Gillian raised his bare hand to meet the blow. The force of the clash echoed with a sharp crack, the sound reverberating through the air. Without hesitation, Gillian retaliated, his axe carving a clean arc through the opponent's torso. Dark blood sprayed violently, splattering across the stormy battlefield as the lifeless body crumpled to the ground. The battle raged on, a relentless onslaught met with Gillian's unwavering might. He stood like an immovable bastion, each swing of his axe a testament to the indomitable will of a warrior who had long mastered the art of war. The enemy collapsed before Gillian, his cries of pain fading into silence. Blood pooled at his feet while Gillian's expression remained cold and detached. The axe in his hand dripped crimson, each drop falling onto the ground with a grim finality. From a distance, the cloaked leader observed the carnage, his chilling voice breaking through the darkness. He muttered bitterly to himself, noting that Gillian had not changed, his strength was as formidable as ever. Yet, a sly smile crept across the leader's face, concealing a deeper scheme brewing behind his calculating gaze. The remaining soldiers quickly reorganized, splitting into two groups to encircle Gillian. Their commander barked orders with sharp precision, urging them to advance more aggressively. Seated atop his horse, Gillian surveyed the battlefield with his piercing gaze. A low scoff escaped his lips, his expression tinged with disdain. He had seen such tactics countless times before and held no respect for their predictable maneuvers. One of the soldiers seemed to notice something amiss, his face paling in realization as he caught sight of the horse charging toward him. A panicked shout erupted from his lips, but it was already too late. Gillian raised his massive axe high, its blade poised for a decisive, devastating strike. The horse surged forward under Gillian's command, its powerful strides carrying him directly into the enemy's formation. His sharp eyes locked onto the soldiers, blocking his path, their swords raised defensively, the steel glinting under the dim light. Yet, Gillian showed no hesitation, his calm unshaken. With a mighty swing, the colossal axe cut through the air, its force creating a vortex of destruction. The impact shattered the enemy's defensive line, the clang of breaking steel resounding through the battlefield. Blood sprayed in all directions, staining the ground in violent streaks of red. The attackers were thrown aside like leaves in a storm, their broken bodies crumpling in agony. Gillian remained unyielding atop his steed, his imposing figure radiating an aura of invincibility. His gaze swept over the remaining soldiers, who trembled in terror at the sight of him, a warrior who seemed more akin to an unstoppable force of nature than a man. One desperate soldier, unable to approach Gillian, let out a frustrated cry. In his panic, he shouted orders to target the horse, demanding they take it down first. Gillian's sharp mind immediately discerned their intent. Reacting swiftly, he turned in the saddle, his massive axe already swinging in a calculated arc. The blade, glowing with an icy blue aura, cut through the air like a tempest, a cold and deadly storm unleashed upon his enemies. The powerful swing of Gillian's axe tore through the advancing enemies, shredding their formation with merciless precision. Screams echoed across the battlefield as soldiers were flung aside, their bodies crumpling to the ground in heaps. Seated atop his horse, Gillian maintained his composure, his sharp eyes fixed ahead. He caught sight of the next threat, a figure descending rapidly from above, their blade blazing with a fiery blue glow. Without hesitation, Gillian raised his axe to intercept the attack. The clash of metal resounded like a thunderclap, reverberating across the blood-soaked field. The assassin's voice seethed with rage as he pressed against Gillian's defense. His bloodshot eyes burned with hatred, his words dripping with venom. He spewed accusations, blaming Gillian for ruining his life and demanding that the old warrior stay out of his current affairs. His grip on his weapon tightened, his body radiating a murderous aura. With a twisted smile, he vowed to kill Gillian himself, no matter the cost. Leaping from above, the assassin aimed his glowing blade directly at Gillian. The old warrior reacted swiftly, lifting his shield to block the strike. The force of the attack, however, was overwhelming. The blade pierced through, wounding the horse beneath him. The beast collapsed with a pained cry, its blood spraying into the air and staining the battlefield. Gillian managed to dismount just in time, rolling across the ground to avoid the crushing fall. The assassin wasted no time, pivoting sharply to close the distance. His eyes gleamed with malice as he advanced, the tip of his sword radiating a chilling energy aimed straight at Gillian. Rising to his feet, Gillian met the assassin's gaze with unflinching resolve. Despite the precarious situation, he showed no signs of fear or hesitation. His axe remained steady in his grip, a symbol of his readiness to retaliate like a god of war standing firm amidst the chaos. With a single, decisive motion, Gillian swung his axe, the sheer force of his attack hurling the assassin backward. The assassin tumbled to the ground, his weapon slipping from his grasp. Gillian's deep voice cut through the storm of battle, his tone cold and resolute as he declared that he was no longer the captain of the Regressed mercenaries. The assassin writhed in pain on the ground, his disbelief evident as he struggled to comprehend Gillian's words. His voice trembled with a mix of fury and exhaustion as he questioned how Gillian could deny being their leader. Gillian remained unyielding, his gaze unshaken as if the assassin's words carried no weight. The hatred, the shouting, it was all meaningless. None of it could alter the undeniable truth: Gillian was no longer the man he once was. The assassin's rage boiled over, his voice cracking as he screamed in defiance. He refused to accept Gillian's denial, his tone thick with bitterness and desperation. To him, there was no other explanation. Gillian was still the one responsible for everything. His words hung in the air, but Gillian stood firm, a towering figure of certainty amid the storm of accusations and bloodshed. Gillian tightened his grip on the haft of his axe, his cold eyes flickering with a resolute light. His voice dropped to a low, steady tone, yet each word resonated like a solemn oath carried through the stormy air. He declared that he had cast away his past, leaving it behind as a relic of another life. A mystical blue glow radiated from the blade of his axe, enveloping him like an aura of rebirth. He stood tall, imposing as a mountain, his presence commanding and unyielding. His voice rose again, this time with a profound authority that seemed to ripple through the battlefield. He affirmed his current identity not as the man he once was, but as someone who now served under the leadership of Ghislaine. The aura of killing intent surrounding Gillian surged like a tempest, freezing the assassin in place. His breathing faltered, and his body stiffened under the overwhelming pressure. His face twisted with disbelief as he stared at the figure before him, a warrior who appeared as if reborn from the fires of the underworld. The assassin's expression contorted with rage, his blood-red eyes blazing with demonic fury. He gritted his teeth, his growl rumbling through the relentless rain. His hatred erupted in a wordless scream as he charged forward, his movements wild and unrestrained. From above, he descended like a cornered beast, his deranged eyes locked onto Gillian. The blade in his hand, razor-sharp and pulsating with murderous intent, reflected the deadly light of the storm. Each raindrop seemed to glint against the steel as his cries of hatred ripped through the downpour, threatening to shatter the oppressive silence. He vowed to kill Gillian at any cost, his words crackling like thunder in the storm. Below, Gillian stood firm, unmoving like a monumental stone amidst the chaos. His presence, steady and unshakable, loomed as a silent challenge to the frenzied attacker hurtling toward him. The storm raged on, but Gillian remained a bastion of unyielding resolve. Under the stormy night sky, torrential rain poured down relentlessly as a deafening crash echoed through the air. Massive boulders descended without warning, tearing through the atmosphere. The thunderous impact shattered the tense silence, heralding a battle that was escalating to its peak. On the rain-soaked battlefield, two figures collided with ferocious speed. Gillian swung his massive axe with calculated precision, intercepting the assassin's sharp blade. The clash of steel reverberated across the area, its sharp, piercing sound cutting through the storm. Gillian held his ground firmly, his overwhelming strength forcing his opponent to strain against the unrelenting pressure. The assassin ground his teeth, his bloodshot eyes blazing with hatred. With sudden aggression, he closed the gap, delivering a powerful punch to Gillian's chest. The force of the blow caused Gillian to stagger back a few steps, his white hair whipping wildly in the wind and rain. Yet, despite the attack, his sharp gaze remained unwavering, his resolve unbroken. The air between them grew heavier, their auras colliding like storm fronts, signaling a battle far from its conclusion. Fixing his glare on Gillian, the assassin's voice emerged hoarse and dripping with resentment. He accused Gillian of abandoning his comrades, stating that after his departure, the mercenary group had fallen apart. Each word struck like a dagger, intensifying the oppressive weight of the night. The assassin's face contorted with fury, his crimson eyes burning with unbridled rage. He spat his grievances, his voice trembling under the weight of his emotions. He blamed Gillian for destroying his sense of purpose, forcing him into a humiliating existence where survival was his only goal. The bitterness and venom in his words erupted like a long, suppressed storm. Gillian remained silent, his piercing eyes fixed intently on his adversary. He neither defended himself nor retaliated with words, instead furrowing his brow slightly as if lost in his own thoughts. Seizing the moment, Gillian shifted swiftly, his shield spinning with tremendous force. The impact sent the assassins stumbling backward, the resounding clash of their weapons cutting through the chaos. The ground beneath them cracked under the pressure of the strike, fissures radiating outward from the force of the blow. The assassin staggered, but his eyes never lost their fiery glare, his hatred refusing to waver. Dust and debris swirled through the rain, the storm carrying it across the battlefield. Gillian's shield, though battered and deeply scratched, remained steadfast as he held it before him. He stood tall, his sharp eyes cutting through the haze like twin blades. Amid the storm of rain and dust, the assassin's voice roared once more, his fury palpable as he shouted, his words filled with malice and frustration that shield. The assassin's face twisted in a painful mixture of resentment and sorrow, his voice dropping to a low, regretful tone as he voiced his lament. He recalled how he had once been willing to dedicate his entire life to making the Regressed mercenaries the strongest group in history. His words, laced with bitterness, slipped through gritted teeth, each syllable carrying the weight of his shattered dreams. His bloodshot eyes, aflame with hatred, seemed to cast all blame squarely upon Gillian, who stood firm before him. Stepping forward with deliberate menace, the assassin spoke again, his tone a venomous cocktail of disdain and fury. He sneered as he accused Gillian of abandoning everything they had built, only to now serve as a mere pawn under a stubborn noble. His finger jabbed toward Gillian, his gaze blazing with fiery contempt, as if his fury could consume the warrior where he stood. The atmosphere grew taut with tension, the air around them heavy and stifling. The assassin's eyes glimmered with a frenzied light as his voice erupted in a thunderous cry. His words reverberated across the battlefield, dripping with unbridled rage. He declared that he could never forgive Gillian for what he had done. His fury exploded outward, a maelstrom of killing intent radiating from his body like an uncontrollable tempest. The assassin's blade glowed with a chilling blue light as he launched a relentless flurry of attacks, each strike cutting through the air like deadly arrows. The sheer power of his assault caused the ground to quake, fissures spreading like cracks in a fragile mirror. Gillian stood unwavering amidst the onslaught, his piercing eyes steady and resolute. Gripping his massive axe with unyielding determination, he braced himself for the barrage of attacks. The battlefield, shrouded in darkness and rain, transformed into a fiery stage where the clash of past and present raged violently. Twisting his body with practiced ease, Gillian swung his colossal axe in a sharp, decisive arc. The weapon's blade shimmered with a radiant purple light, tearing through the air and obliterating the incoming strikes. The ground quaked as the failed attack scattered in a shower of sparks and debris, shattering into fragments that were lost amid the dust and chaos. Refusing to yield, the assassin surged forward once more. This time, he leapt from above, his blade glinting with a frosty blue hue that radiated malice. The weapon arced downward with lethal intent, aiming directly for Gillian. With lightning-fast reflexes, Gillian sidestepped the attack, his movements precise and fluid. His silver hair whipped through the stormy air, his cold, sharp eyes locking onto his enemy, who now hung suspended in midair. The rain fell harder, the battlefield alive with the clash of wills and the unrelenting storm that mirrored their conflict. Gillian surged forward, his massive axe arcing downward in a crushing vertical slash. The assassin barely managed to raise his weapon in defense, but the sheer force of Gillian's strike sent him skidding backward across the ground. Their eyes met briefly amidst the chaos, a silent clash of wills as a surge of killing intent radiated from both combatants, intensifying the already brutal confrontation. The two opponents closed the distance once more, their weapons colliding with a resounding clang that echoed across the battlefield. The ground beneath them cracked under the pressure of their strikes, sending dirt and debris flying in all directions. Neither fighter showed any sign of yielding, their duel an unrelenting storm of steel and fury. Grinding his teeth in frustration, the assassin's voice dripped with mockery and bitterness. He taunted Gillian, claiming that his strength belonged to an era long past, a shadow of what it once was when he had led the Regressed mercenaries years ago. His bloodshot eyes glimmered with the weight of old obsessions, as though the specter of the past refused to release him. Gillian remained steadfast, his icy gaze fixed on his adversary. The assassin's words, laden with venom, sought to pierce through his resolve, but they merely faded into irrelevance. To Gillian, they were nothing more than the murmurs of a restless storm. The assassin let out a furious roar, his blade spinning violently as it unleashed waves of raw energy. His voice, filled with seething hatred, carried through the battlefield as he berated Gillian. He declared that while Gillian had squandered time tending to his daughter, he had sharpened his skills through countless battles, growing stronger with each passing day. Charging forward, the assassin's blade carved through the air with devastating precision. Its overwhelming power threatened to consume everything in its path. Gillian, however, moved with fluid grace, sidestepping the assault with an ease that belied the ferocity of the attack. His unyielding stance, his sharp eyes unflinching, stood as a testament to a warrior who had long mastered the storms of combat. This duel, he knew, was more than a test of strength, it was a collision of past and present. A cold, triumphant laugh escaped the assassin's lips. His voice, laced with arrogant confidence, proclaimed Gillian's obsolescence. His movements quickened, blurring into a whirlwind of speed and glowing blue light as he launched his next attack, his figure almost disappearing amidst the flashes of energy radiating from his blade. Gillian shifted slightly, his foot pressing firmly into the ground to maintain balance against the relentless assault. Suddenly, the assassin revealed a hidden weapon, sharp throwing blades concealed within his armor. In a swift motion, he hurled them toward Gillian. The golden projectiles sliced through the air at incredible speed, their sharp edges gleaming with lethal intent as they closed in on their target. Gillian pivoted swiftly, his massive axe rising to intercept the onslaught of throwing blades hurtling toward him. A series of sharp metallic clangs echoed through the air as the projectiles ricocheted off the axe's surface. Yet, one slipped past his defenses, grazing his shoulder and leaving a faint tear in his coat. The assassin pressed on relentlessly. Launching himself into the air, he descended with his blade poised for a crushing strike. Gillian's eyes narrowed, his instincts flaring as he registered the incoming attack. In an instant, his calloused hands gripped the axe tighter, bracing for the decisive clash. The silhouettes of the two combatants melded into the stormy night, their battle intensifying with every strike. The assassin spiraled through the air like a cyclone, his figure twisting in a deadly dance as his blade glimmered with a lethal brilliance. The distance between him and Gillian closed rapidly, the oppressive weight of his killing intent saturating the battlefield. The assassin roared, his crimson eyes glowing with unrestrained madness. His voice, harsh and guttural, shattered the stillness of the night as he declared the fight's end. Channeling the full force of his pent-up rage, he swung his blade down with devastating power, aiming to cleave through Gillian. A razor-sharp slicing sound pierced the air, freezing the battlefield in an instant. Time seemed to halt as the moment teetered on the edge of a decisive conclusion. But Gillian remained steadfast. His unyielding gaze gleamed with cold determination. In a single, fluid motion, his hand shot out and caught the descending blade mid-air. A luminous blue aura enveloped his palm, seeping outward to engulf the weapon and halt the tremendous force behind it as though it were nothing. The assassin's eyes widened in shock, his expression contorted in disbelief at the sight before him. A heavy silence fell over the battlefield, stretching for a brief, tense moment before the oppressive energy of their confrontation threatened to erupt into chaos once more. Standing firm, Gillian held the dagger in his grasp, his hand glowing with an eerie blue radiance that seemed to nullify the weapon's lethal energy. His voice, calm yet brimming with authority, resonated through the thick air. He questioned the assassin's motives, his tone carrying an edge that cut deeper than any blade. "So this is the grudge you've chosen to carry?" The assassin stared back, his face pale as beads of cold sweat streaked down his brow. His lips trembled and his thoughts raced in panic. The realization struck him like a thunderbolt. Gillian had surrounded his hand with mana to stop the blade. His disbelief deepened, his mind grappling with the terrifying possibility. Could it be, he wondered, that Gillian had not yet revealed the full extent of his strength? Gillian gave the assassin no time to dwell on his thoughts. With a swift motion, his arm swung forcefully, unleashing a sudden burst of mana that erupted like a tidal wave. The impact flung the assassin backward, his body crashing hard against the ground. Blood sprayed into the air as his face contorted in pain, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A massive column of energy surged from the earth, engulfing the assassin in a blinding light. His body was hurled upward, spinning helplessly within the raging vortex of the attack. Below, Gillian stood tall, his piercing eyes following the scene with neither hesitation nor mercy. The assassin landed heavily, his trembling form slumping to the ground. His hands clawed at the dirt in desperation as he struggled to rise. Around him, fierce winds swirled, the remnants of Gillian's devastating strike still lingering in the charged atmosphere. Despite his body quaking from exhaustion, his eyes burned with an unrelenting flame of hatred. From behind a massive tree, Gillian emerged with steady steps, his imposing figure cutting through the stormy battlefield. His deep, measured voice carried across the tense air as he spoke, his tone laden with quiet authority. He admitted his confusion, his words simple but deliberate. The assassin's head snapped up, his wide eyes betraying his shock. His labored breathing faltered as he tried to comprehend the moment. Halting a few paces away, Gillian fixed his icy gaze on the assassin, his expression unreadable yet unwavering. He raised the dagger still clenched in his hand, the blade glinting faintly under the scattered light. His voice, sharp and cold, sliced through the assassin's scattered thoughts as he observed, almost clinically, that if revenge had been his true goal, he had plenty of chances to pursue it. The assassin's face twisted in turmoil, the weight of Gillian's words crashing against his pride like a hammer against brittle stone. His hands trembled as they clenched into fists, but he remained silent. Gillian stood unmoving, exuding an aura of steadfast authority as though daring the assassin to respond. Gillian's voice echoed once more, firm and resonant, every word digging deeper into the assassin's psyche. He asked why the assassin had waited so long to act if vengeance was truly his purpose. His penetrating gaze bore into the man before him, seeking answers that the assassin seemed reluctant to give. A faint, bitter chuckle escaped the assassin's lips, his voice weak yet dripping with scorn. His laughter was tinged with irony, as though mocking himself as much as his adversary. Through the blood smeared across his mouth, he forced a pained smile and whispered that Gillian only knew half the story. He wiped the blood from his lips with the back of his hand, his tone gravelly as he continued. He recounted his journey to the places Gillian had once inhabited, the places where the great leader of the Regressed mercenaries should have been. His words faltered as a heavy silence enveloped him, his eyes shadowed with the weight of memories that lingered like an unhealed wound. In the shadows of his memories, the assassin's voice grew coarse and bitter, each word a blade cutting deep into the silence. He recalled what he had found in place of the legendary figure he sought, only a frail old man, slumped in a decrepit room with shoulders weighed down by the burdens of a lifelong past. The image of Gillian, hollow and defeated, lingered in his mind like a ghost haunting his vengeance. The assassin reflected on that moment, his disdain sharpening his words. He had deemed Gillian unworthy of death, a pitiful relic undeserving of his blade. The assassin's voice, laced with scorn, tore through the suffocating quiet around them, as if aiming to shatter Gillian's pride. Red eyes burning with pain and unyielding hatred, the assassin's expression contorted with anguish. His voice rose to a trembling cry, each word trembling with fury and despair as he demanded to know where the Gillian he had once admired had gone. The question hung in the air, heavy with grief and betrayal. Gillian offered no response. His gaze lowered, his eyes clouded with a profound, indescribable melancholy. No words emerged to fill the oppressive silence. Instead, the weight of unspoken truths bore down on the atmosphere, enveloping the battlefield in its somber grip. Drawing a shaky breath, the assassin's trembling hands dug into the dirt, his grip tightening in a desperate bid to steady himself. With a sharp motion, he flung his sword to the ground, the blade burying itself into the dry earth with a resonant thud. His head tilted upward, his eyes locking onto Gillian's with a bold, unyielding stare. His voice, though hoarse, rang out with a challenge. He demanded Gillian pick up his weapon. The assassin remained motionless as the sword trembled faintly from the impact, its vibrations echoing the tension in the air. Rising to his feet with deliberate resolve, he squared his stance against the man before him. The moment stretched into a fleeting silence, a fragile calm heralding the storm about to break. Gillian's grip tightened around the hilt of the blade he now held, his eyes gleaming with an unshakable resolve. His voice carried the weight of a bitter truth as he admitted his own helplessness, bound by the will of others. His calloused fingers, firm with years of battles past, lifted the blade high, a solemn symbol of his enduring determination. Amid the swirling chaos of the battlefield, Gillian stood tall, his figure illuminated faintly by the dim light breaking through the gloom. He exuded the aura of a leader from a bygone era, his broad frame and unwavering presence evoking the memory of the captain he had once been. The sword in his hand rose high, a silent defiance against the world itself. In that moment, Gillian was a fortress, unyielding and unshakable, a testament to a strength that time had not eroded. Gillian's eyes gleamed with a sharp intensity, his voice deep and resolute, resonating through the tense air like a bell announcing the onset of battle. He declared his intentions with unwavering resolve, his words a promise of respect delivered in the only way he knew as the captain of the Regressed mercenaries. The flicker of determination in his gaze suggested that the greatness of his past had never truly faded. At this moment, Gillian stood as the man he once was, a captain both revered and feared, a figure whose presence alone commanded the battlefield. Without another word, he tightened his grip on his weapon. His movements were swift and precise as he dodged the assassin's relentless attacks, his eyes alight with a fiery resolve. This, he thought, was the battle that truly mattered. The assassin's lips curled into a dark smile, his voice low and filled with bitter satisfaction as he whispered that this was the moment he had awaited. The clash reached its peak. Blades of light tore through the night sky as Gillian and Viego exchanged a storm of devastating blows. Each strike carried the weight of their histories, their strengths, and their unrelenting determination, neither giving the other an inch. At last, with a thunderous swing, Gillian brought his axe down upon Viego. The force of the blow sent the assassin to his knees. Bloodied and gasping for air, Viego locked eyes with the man who had bested him. His voice, tinged with grudging admiration, trembled as he uttered Gillian's title. He would always remember the captain of the 5th Division of the Regressed mercenaries. Gillian turned away without a word, his voice low and steady as he responded, acknowledging Viego's name, Viego Valanos. Behind him, the assassin's blood splattered across the ground, and the knife slipped from his lifeless fingers. As the battle subsided, Gillian stood amidst the wreckage, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The battlefield, now a chaotic ruin, bore witness to his strength and his past. Two younger comrades approached cautiously, their eyes wide with awe. One of them spoke, his voice filled with a mix of admiration and practicality, suggesting that selling all the equipment scattered around the field could bring in a fortune. Gillian allowed himself a faint smile, his voice calm yet tinged with regret as he apologized for the time he had delayed. He admitted his unnecessary hesitation, though his tone carried the weight of deeper thoughts. Ghislaine, observing the scene, reassured him with a gentle tone, his thoughts brimming with respect. Gillian, he mused silently, was even more extraordinary than he had anticipated. The man's reputation was well earned, but seeing his prowess firsthand was something else entirely. Reflecting on his own beginnings as a mercenary, Ghislaine recalled how tales of Gillian had been shared among his superiors. Those stories had inspired the foundation of Ghislaine's ambitions to become the king of mercenaries. His swift action in securing such a trustworthy ally now felt like a stroke of fortune. Turning toward Gillian, Ghislaine spoke with a voice imbued with quiet reverence. He asked if Gillian remembered who the assassin truly was. Gillian turned away, a heavy sigh escaping him as the weight of memories pressed upon his shoulders. The name Regressed mercenaries surged through his mind like a storm, each memory vivid and unrelenting. Once he had been the captain of a renowned group of mercenaries, a gathering of the strongest warriors united under his banner. That time felt distant, but its echoes remained ever present. His voice, low and rough, carried the sadness of betrayal and the bitterness of regret. He admitted that the assassin had once been a comrade, a brother in arms who had fought beside him in their shared past. The young man in the crimson coat stood silently beside Gillian, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. A faint curiosity and sympathy reflected in his expression as thoughts crossed his mind. He pondered the mention of old comrades, wondering what lives they might have led before their paths diverged. It seemed to him that, no matter where life led, everyone would eventually return to where they began. Ghislaine then proposed that they gather the spoils left behind by their defeated enemies, reasoning that it could bring in a decent profit. Belinda, with her characteristic enthusiasm, expressed agreement. Her voice carried a playful tone as she encouraged Gillian to lead the effort, emphasizing his strength. Gillian turned to face her, his expression unchanging and his voice steady. He released a soft sigh, dismissing her suggestion with a remark that he wasn't her subordinate. His words, a mix of jest and seriousness, softened the tension that still lingered from the recent battle. Yet, within Gillian's mind, the memory of Diego's parting words lingered, casting a shadow over his thoughts. 2 days later, as they approached the Perdium territory, Belinda stretched with exaggerated relief. The sight of their destination prompted her to remark on how close they were to finally reaching their goal. Gillian, observing the landscape, asked if the place ahead was indeed Perdium. Ghislaine confirmed with a nod, but his thoughts momentarily drifted. The sight of his homeland reminded him of the comfort in having a place to return to. He reflected inwardly, feeling reassured by the notion that, regardless of where he went, there would always be a home waiting for him. Noticing Gillian's inquisitive expression, Ghislaine questioned his impressions of Perdium. Gillian responded briefly, offering a neutral comment that it seemed fine. Ghislaine's gaze shifted to the surroundings, his tone sharpening as he assessed the reality before them. He noted the dilapidated houses and abandoned fields, criticizing the condition of the territory. The houses, he explained, were beyond repair, and the fields had been left to decay after all the able-bodied workers were conscripted into the military. Gillian listened in silence, his eyes sweeping over the desolate scenery. The barren fields and crumbling buildings painted a grim picture. With a heavy tone, he acknowledged the dire state of the territory, admitting that, while he had heard of Perdium's long-standing conflicts with the northern barbarians, witnessing the aftermath firsthand revealed a far graver situation than he had imagined. Belinda's thoughts wandered as the group approached the desolate landscape. She couldn't help but think to herself that this territory should be a place someone among them knew intimately. The irony of the situation brought a faint smirk to her lips, but she kept her observation to herself. Ghislaine, however, was resolute. Surveying the deteriorating surroundings, he firmly resolved to confront the challenges ahead. He knew this would be a prolonged struggle, but his determination only solidified further. Inwardly, he acknowledged the need for Gillian's support, recognizing that this battle would require more than just strength. The ultimate goal was clear in his mind: dismantle all remnants of Duke Delphine's influence and defend the undeniable truths of their existence. No matter the cost, Ghislaine vowed to restore the land to its former state of glory. The rhythmic sound of the carriage wheels turning against the rough terrain punctuated their journey, a steady reminder of the road ahead. Out of nowhere, Belinda's voice broke the silence. Her tone carried a note of surprise as she gestured toward a figure in the distance. The sight had caught her off guard, and she called out, questioning who it might be.